Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still have a hard time talking about what happened that night back in 2003. My cousin Miguel and I were just cruising around our neighborhood in Orlando. Nothing out of the ordinary. This was before all the development happened. You know, before they built those massive shopping centers and housing communities that are there now. Back then, it was mostly just scattered homes surrounded by dense Florida woods. I was 22 at the time, Miguel was 24, and we were just killing time like we often did on weekends. It was around 3 in the morning, and we were in my old Chevy Impala, driving around those quiet suburban streets. The night was humid as hell, typical Florida weather, and we had the windows down, letting in what little breeze there was. We weren't drunk or high or anything. I need to make that clear right away, because nobody ever believes me otherwise. We were completely sober, just enjoying the quiet night. We ended up pulling over near this small lake that had a daycare center and playground on the other side. During the day, this place would be filled with kids and parents, but at night, it was completely deserted. Just streetlights casting these weird yellow glows on the empty swings and slides. I remember thinking how eerie it looked, but in a peaceful way, you know? Miguel wanted to smoke a cigarette, and I didn't allow that in my car. My mama just helped me get it, and I was super strict about keeping it clean. So he got out while I stayed inside, fiddling with the radio, trying to find something decent to listen to. I wasn't paying much attention to him until I heard this weird sound, like a sharp intake of breath or something, coming from outside. When I looked up, I saw Miguel standing there by the passenger door, and something was off. His body language had completely changed. He went from relaxed to rigid in seconds, and he was fumbling with the door handle like his fingers suddenly didn't work right. The cigarette he'd just lit was on the ground, still burning. At first I thought maybe he'd seen a cop or something, and we were about to get busted for being out so late in a park area. "What's wrong with you, man?" I called out, but he didn't answer. He just kept yanking at the door handle, missing it somehow even though it was right there in front of him. That's when I felt this weird sensation creep up my spine. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you're being watched? I glanced in my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. Standing behind my car, maybe 15 feet back, was this thing. I say thing because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing as anything normal or natural. It was massive. I'm talking at least 7 feet tall, maybe even taller. It had this solid build like a bodybuilder, but more, I don't know, proportional, natural. Just huge all over, broad shoulders, thick limbs, and it was covered completely in brown fur or hair, not patchy like a mangy animal, but fully covered like a well-kept coat. Even in the dim glow from the streetlight, I could make out details. The hair was longer in some areas, particularly around what seemed to be its shoulders and head. The color wasn't uniform either. It was this dark chocolate brown with lighter patches here and there. I remember thinking how weird it was that my brain was registering these little details while simultaneously freaking the fuck out. The scariest part was that it was just standing there, completely motionless, like it was studying us. I couldn't see its face clearly because of the shadows and the distance, but I could feel its eyes on me. It didn't make any aggressive moves, didn't make any noise. It was just watching, almost like it was as surprised to see us as we were to see it. I don't know how long I stared at it in the mirror, probably just a few seconds, but it felt like hours. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My palms started sweating immediately, and I got this copper taste in my mouth. Fight or flight was kicking in hard, but I was frozen. What snapped me out of it was Miguel still struggling with the door. I reached over and pushed it open from the inside, and he practically fell into the car. The moment I moved, the creature's posture changed. It was subtle, just a slight shift of weight, but somehow I knew it was getting ready to move too. "Drive, Carlos! Fucking drive!" Miguel was screaming, his voice higher than I'd ever heard it before. He was clutching the dashboard with white knuckles, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal so hard, I'm surprised it didn't go through the floor. The tires spun and screeched before finding grip, and we shot forward. In the split second before we took off, I saw the creature move. And Jesus Christ, the speed of it was unreal. It didn't run away like a person would. It was like it folded into the darkness at the edge of the parking lot, disappearing between one blink and the next. It was there, and then it wasn't, moving with this fluid grace that nothing that size should possess. We tore out of that parking lot like the devil himself was chasing us. Miguel was still freaking out, alternating between looking behind us and curling up in his seat like he was trying to disappear. "Did you see that? Did you fucking see that?" he kept saying over and over. "What the hell was that thing?" I remember asking, though I wasn't really expecting an answer. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. "I don't know, man. I don't fucking know." Miguel was sweating, his voice trembling. I was just smoking, and I heard this, I don't know, like branches breaking or something from behind the car. I turned around, and it was just standing there at the edge of the trees, watching me. Then it took a step forward, and I couldn't move at first. Then I tried to get back in the car, but my hands were shaking so bad. We drove straight toward our neighborhood, taking the main roads instead of the back streets we usually used. The streetlights and occasional passing cars made us feel safer somehow. But then, about 5 minutes into our drive, this weird feeling came over me. It wasn't fear anymore. It was curiosity. "We should go back," I said, surprising even myself. "Are you insane?" Miguel looked at me like I'd grown a second head. That thing could still be there. "Exactly," I said. "Don't you want to know what it was? What if we just saw something, I don't know, something that isn't supposed to exist?" I can't explain why, but I looped around at the next intersection and headed back toward the lake. Miguel was cursing me out the whole time, alternating between English and Spanish, calling me every name in the book. But he didn't try to grab the wheel or stop me. I think part of him wanted to know too. When we got back to the lake, I drove much slower this time, scanning the tree line and the playground area. I kept the car in drive, ready to bolt again if necessary. We circled the entire lake. It wasn't very big, maybe a quarter mile around, but there was no sign of the creature. No movement in the trees, no unusual sounds, nothing. We even pulled over at a different spot, keeping the engine running, and rolled down the windows to listen. All we heard were the normal Florida night sounds, frogs, insects, the occasional car in the distance. It was like nothing had happened, like we'd imagined the whole thing, but we hadn't. I know what I saw. After about 20 minutes of searching, we gave up and went home. We didn't talk much on the drive back. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, especially not in suburban Orlando. When I dropped Miguel off, he just said, "Let's not tell anyone about this, okay? They'll just think we're crazy." I agreed, and for years I kept that promise. I didn't tell anyone about what we saw that night. Not my parents, not my friends, not even my girlfriend who later became my wife. What would I say? That my cousin and I saw Bigfoot in Orlando? That there was some kind of giant hair-covered humanoid hanging out by a children's playground at 3 in the morning? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head, but I never forgot. The image of that creature standing behind my car is burned into my memory. Sometimes I'll wake up from a dream where I'm back in that parking lot and the creature is getting closer and closer to the car, but in slow motion, like I'm watching a film frame by frame. I'll wake up drenched in sweat, the details still vivid in my mind, the texture of its fur, the width of its shoulders. the way it held itself with this strange, almost human posture, but not quite. I've spent countless hours since then researching, trying to find an explanation for what we saw. I've looked into Florida wildlife, thinking maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but that doesn't fit. Bears don't move the way this thing moved, and they don't have that body shape. I've read about escaped exotic pets, about people's overactive imaginations, about the effects of fear on perception. None of it explains what we saw. About 5 years after it happened, I finally broke down and started looking into Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings. I'd always dismissed those stories as hoaxes or misidentifications, but after what I saw, I couldn't be so quick to judge. And the more I read, the more similarities I found between other people's accounts and my own experience. The height, the build, the way it moved, the apparent intelligence in its behavior, the way it seemed just as surprised to see us as we were to see it. Miguel and I don't talk about it much even now. When we do, it's always in this half-joking way, like we're not sure if we should take our own experience seriously, but I can see it in his eyes when the subject comes up. He remembers it just as clearly as I do. He believes what we saw was real, even if he doesn't want to admit it out loud. What bugs me the most, after all these years, is the why of it all. Why was this creature in suburban Orlando? Was it passing through? Was it lost? Does it live in those patches of woods that still exist between the developments? And why have I never seen or heard of anyone else encountering something similar in that area? Sometimes I drive by that lake when I visit my parents, who still live in the same neighborhood. The area has changed so much. The woods have been cut back for new houses, the playground has been renovated, and the daycare center expanded. I always slow down and scan the tree line, half expecting to see that figure standing there watching me. It never is, of course, but sometimes, especially at dusk when the light is fading, I get that same feeling I had that night. That prickling sensation of being watched. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or some unknown species or what. All I know is that it was real. It was there, and for a brief moment, our worlds intersected. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers us too, the two humans in the car who disturbed its late-night wanderings. Does it tell its own version of this story? Does it wonder about us the way I wonder about it? I may never know what really happened that night, or what that creature truly was. But one thing's for certain, I'll never forget those few minutes by the lake, when everything I thought I knew about the world around me changed forever. That moment is frozen in my memory, as clear as if it happened yesterday. And sometimes when I'm alone at night and hear an unexpected sound outside my window, I can't help but wonder, is it back? Story 2. I've worked in construction management for almost 15 years, and I've always prided myself on being level-headed and rational. My crew knows me as the guy who doesn't tolerate ghost stories or excuses. I deal in concrete facts, measurements, deadlines, things you can quantify and verify. What happened last Thursday has shaken that foundation completely, and I still don't know who to tell or how to process it. I was running point on a new development project southeast of Orlando, about 40 minutes from the city in what's basically untouched Florida wilderness. The developer had purchased several hundred acres of land to build a new mixed-use community, and we were in the early stages of site assessment. The property is mostly pine flatwoods with some cypress wetlands, typical Florida landscape. Nothing that seemed particularly special or different from dozens of other projects I've managed. That morning started like any other. I arrived on site around 7:30, coffee in hand, tablet loaded with the day's agenda. We had a project meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock with representatives from the architecture firm, the civil engineers, the environmental consultant, and a few of my key crew supervisors. 8 people total, all professionals who've been in the business for years. The meeting point was what would eventually become the main entrance to the development. Just a clearing right now with some survey stakes and our temporary job trailer. The weather was typical for Florida in early spring, already hitting 80 degrees by 9, humid but not unbearable, with a light breeze coming through the pines. We gathered around the portable table we'd set up outside the trailer. I prefer these initial meetings to be held outdoors when possible. It gives everyone a better sense of the landscape we're working with. As the meeting got underway, I was focused on my presentation about the timeline for the initial clearing and grading. About 20 minutes in, while the environmental consultant was discussing protected species we needed to watch for, something caught my eye at the tree line. The clearing we were in was large, maybe 2 acres, with dense woods surrounding it on all sides. What I noticed was movement about 150 to 200 yards away, just inside the tree line to the east of our position. At first, I didn't think much of it. This area has plenty of wildlife, deer, wild hogs, even the occasional black bear. I've seen them all on various job sites over the years. But something about this movement was different. It wasn't the random wandering of an animal. It seemed deliberate, like something was shifting position behind the trees. I tried to stay engaged in the meeting, but I kept glancing over at that spot in the tree line. The others were deep in conversation about wetland mitigation requirements, so no one noticed my distraction. What I initially thought might be a deer, or maybe even one of our surveyors checking something in the distance, started to make less and less sense the more I observed it. The figure, and I was becoming increasingly certain it was a figure of some kind, was tall. Much taller than a man should be at that distance, and bulky. Not fat, but broad, powerful looking. It moved from one tree to another, always staying partially concealed, but I could see enough to know this wasn't normal. The movement was smooth, controlled. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose. I've spent my entire adult life in the woods on various construction projects. I know what people look like moving through underbrush. They crash through it, make noise, get caught on branches. This thing moved silently through extremely dense vegetation. The way it navigated the forest was unlike anything I've ever seen from a human. The meeting continued around me, but I was finding it harder to concentrate. I kept my face neutral, occasionally nodding or commenting on the discussion, but my attention was fixed on the tree line. Then I saw it lean out slightly from behind a large pine tree, as if it was trying to get a better look at us. That's when a chill ran through me, despite the Florida heat. Its head was level with branches that had to be at least 7 or 8 feet off the ground. I'm 6'2" myself, and I know what a tall person looks like in perspective. This was much bigger than any person I've ever seen. The color was wrong too, a reddish brown that blended with the pine bark, but was clearly not clothing or equipment. I was about to say something to the group when it suddenly withdrew behind the tree. For a few moments, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Then it moved again, this time more decisively, turning away from our direction and walking deeper into the woods. The way it walked, on 2 legs with a smooth, rolling gait, was distinctly bipedal but not quite human. It disappeared into the thicker forest beyond the initial tree line. The whole observation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt much longer. I realized I'd completely lost track of the meeting discussion, and when Mark, one of the engineers, asked me a direct question about the drainage plans, I had to ask him to repeat himself. I played it off as being distracted by some notes I was taking, but honestly, my mind was racing. Should I tell the group what I'd just seen? These were serious professionals, architects, engineers, business owners. How would they react if I told them I'd just spotted what could only be described as a massive, hairy, humanoid figure watching us from the woods? At best, they'd think I was joking. At worst, they'd question my competence or sobriety. So I said nothing and forced myself to refocus on the meeting. We wrapped up around 11:30. As everyone packed up their materials and headed to their vehicles, I told them I needed to check on something with the survey markers and would be along shortly. As soon as they were out of sight, I walked directly toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. The distance seemed longer on foot than it had looked from our meeting area. The ground was uneven, covered with palmetto scrub and wire grass that made walking difficult. As I got closer to the tree line, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A path of crushed vegetation leading into the woods, as if something very heavy had moved through it recently. This wasn't the random trampling you might see from deer or hogs. It was a distinct path about 3 feet wide, with plants bent and broken in a consistent direction. Following this path led me to the exact pine tree where I'd seen the figure standing. It was an old slash pine, probably 60 feet tall with a thick trunk. Standing at its base, I looked up at the branches where I'd seen the creature's head level. The lowest substantial branch was well above my reach. I had to jump to touch it, and even then, I could barely graze it with my fingertips. That put it at least 8 feet off the ground, maybe more. The path of disturbed vegetation continued deeper into the woods, but something stopped me from following it further. A feeling I can't really explain. A primal warning in the back of my mind that told me not to pursue this any further, at least not alone. I've never considered myself a fearful person, but standing there at the edge of those woods, looking at the physical evidence of something enormous having stood in that very spot, watching us, it rattled me in a way nothing ever has. I did notice something else before I left that area. A strange, musky odor that wasn't typical of the forest. It reminded me vaguely of wet dog, combined with something else I couldn't identify. It wasn't overpowering, just noticeable enough to register as unusual. I took a few photos of the trampled vegetation path with my phone, though looking at them later, they don't really convey the scale or the deliberateness of what I saw in person. They just looked like pictures of scrubby Florida underbrush to anyone who wasn't there. When I got back to the job trailer, the others were already gone. I sat in my truck for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. I've always scoffed at stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Those were tales for campers and conspiracy theorists, not for practical men like me who deal in blueprints and concrete. But what else could explain what I'd witnessed? A person in a costume, in the middle of private property in rural Florida, standing for minutes on end watching a construction meeting. It made no sense. I drove home in a daze that evening. My wife noticed something was off when I barely touched my dinner. I told her I was just stressed about the new project, which wasn't entirely untrue. How do you tell your spouse of 12 years that you think you saw a creature that isn't supposed to exist? It's been 5 days now, and I haven't told anyone about what I saw. I went back to the site the next day with the excuse of checking some measurements, hoping to find more evidence or maybe a rational explanation. The path through the vegetation was still visible, but already starting to spring back. I walked further along it this time, following it about 100 yards into the woods before it disappeared in a marshy area where I couldn't continue without proper gear. The project is moving forward as scheduled. We're set to begin clearing operations next month. I find myself wondering what will happen when the heavy equipment moves in and the forest comes down. Will we find something? Will whatever I saw simply move deeper into the surrounding wilderness? There are thousands of acres of undeveloped land in that region. I've started researching Florida Bigfoot sightings online, something I would have laughed at just a week ago. There are more reports from Central Florida than I would have expected, including some from areas not far from our project site. Many describe a large reddish-brown creature, exactly what I saw. I'm not sure what to do with this experience. Part of me wants to forget it and move on. After all, I have a reputation and a career to protect. But another part can't let it go. The part that knows what I saw was real, that measured the height of those branches, that smelled that strange odor, that saw the path of broken vegetation. Every time I'm on site now, I find myself watching the tree line. The crew has noticed my distraction, though they assume it's just the pressure of the new project. Yesterday, we were reviewing the clearing plan. and I found myself wondering if I could adjust it to leave more of the eastern forest intact, the direction where the figure disappeared. It's ridiculous, I know. This is a multi-million-dollar development. I can't alter plans because I think I saw something in the woods that conventional science says doesn't exist. But I know what I saw. I know how big it was. I know how it moved. And most disturbing of all, I know it was watching us, studying us, with an intelligence that seemed all too aware and purposeful. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to find explanations. Maybe it was a bear standing unusually upright. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe the stress of managing too many projects simultaneously caused me to misinterpret something ordinary. But none of these explanations fit what I witnessed. A bear doesn't stand 8 to 9 feet tall on its hind legs for minutes at a time, moving silently through underbrush. No human prankster could have navigated that dense vegetation without making noise or getting caught in the thorny palmettos. And I've been under much more stress on other projects without hallucinating giant forest creatures. I go back to the site tomorrow for another meeting. I've decided to bring a better camera with a zoom lens, under the pretense of documenting the pre-development condition of the property. I don't know if I'll see anything again. Part of me hopes I don't, but I need to be prepared. Whatever it was, it seemed to be deliberately observing our meeting, trying to understand what we were doing there. That's what unsettles me the most. Not just its size or its appearance, but its apparent curiosity and intelligence. If these creatures exist, if they've been living alongside us undetected in these vanishing wild places, what happens when we keep pushing further into their territory? What happens when there's nowhere left for them to hide? I don't have answers, just questions that keep me awake at night. All I know is that for about 5 minutes last Thursday morning, I glimpsed something that shouldn't exist, according to everything I've been taught to believe. And no matter how hard I try to rationalize it away, the evidence was there. Flattened vegetation, branches too high for a normal person to reach, and the distinct feeling of being watched by something that didn't want to be seen. I used to think people who claimed to see these things were attention seekers or were mistaken. Now I understand why so many witnesses stay silent. Who would believe me? What would this do to my professional credibility? So I keep it to myself and watch the tree line, wondering if it's out there still, watching and waiting as we prepare to transform its home into another piece of suburban Florida. Story 3. I'm still processing what happened 2 weeks ago, and I've been debating whether to share this or not. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure this community might be one of the few places where I won't just get laughed at. I've been interested in cryptids for years, especially Bigfoot. My friends always gave me crap about it. Typical jokes about me watching too many monster hunting shows or spending too much time on conspiracy websites. Whatever. I know what I believe. Florida actually has a pretty long history of Bigfoot sightings, even if it doesn't get the attention that the Pacific Northwest does. The skunk ape, the Miaka ape, the Barden booger, different names for what might be the same creature. Anyway, about 2 weeks ago, me and 3 friends, Jason, Mike, and Donna, decided to go looking for evidence ourselves in Fort Christmas, Florida. There had been a few reports in that area over the years, nothing major, but enough to pique my interest. The place is perfect for something that wants to hide. Lots of wilderness, wetlands, wildlife preserves, and not a ton of people out there at night. We left Orlando around 8 in the evening, packed into my Honda Civic. I'd brought along some basic equipment, a good camera with night vision capabilities, a digital recorder for any sounds, some plaster of Paris in case we found footprints, and 4 high-powered flashlights. Mike brought some beef jerky as bait, which we all thought was stupid, but whatever. Donna was skeptical about the whole thing, but came along for the adventure. Jason was the most enthusiastic besides me. He'd had a weird experience in the Ocala National Forest a few years back that he couldn't explain. We arrived at Fort Christmas around 9:30. It was a warm night, probably around 80 degrees, with that sticky Florida humidity that makes your clothes cling to your skin. The moon was nearly full, which gave us decent visibility. But there were patches of clouds moving through, sometimes blocking it completely. We started by driving slowly down Fort Christmas Road, scanning the tree line with our flashlights. The windows were down, despite the mosquitoes, because I'd read that Bigfoot researchers often detect unusual smells before visual contact. There wasn't much traffic, maybe one car every 15 minutes or so. Mostly we were alone out there, with nothing but the sounds of frogs and cicadas. "This is boring as shit," Mike said, after we'd been at it for about 45 minutes. "We should go to the bar in Chulota instead. Just give it some time," I told him. "We haven't even checked the side roads yet." We turned onto a narrow dirt road that cut through a densely wooded area. According to my research, it would lead us toward a wildlife preserve that backed up to a power line corridor. Exactly the kind of isolated pathway that a large creature might use to move around undetected. The road was rough, full of potholes, and my car bounced along, headlights cutting through the darkness. Jason pointed out a small pull-off area. "Let's park here for a bit and just listen," he suggested. I pulled over and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate and heavy. Without the car's AC, the humidity pressed in on us, and within minutes we were all sweating. We sat there for maybe 20 minutes, occasionally shining our flashlights into the brush, mostly just listening and watching. "I'm going to play some calls," I said, pulling out my phone. I'd downloaded recordings of alleged Bigfoot vocalizations, those eerie whoops and howls that researchers have captured over the years. I played one at medium volume, and we all listened intently for any response. Nothing. "Try another one," Jason urged. I played a different recording, this one more of a series of knocks, like wood striking wood, another behavior attributed to Bigfoot. Again, nothing came back to us from the darkness. "This is such bullshit," Mike muttered, scrolling through his phone. "We could be at Wolfie's right now having beers." "Give it another hour," I said. "If we don't see anything, we'll go." We continued down the dirt road, driving even slower now, maybe 5 miles per hour. The trees pressed in close on both sides, branches occasionally scraping against the car. According to my map, we were getting close to where the power line corridor intersected with the road. That's when Donna suddenly grabbed my arm. "Stop the car," she whispered. I hit the brakes immediately. "What? What did you see?" "I don't know. Something moved over there." She pointed to the right side of the road about 50 feet ahead, behind that big palm tree, something big. We all stared in that direction. I killed the headlights, thinking they might be scaring whatever it was away. The darkness was almost complete for a moment, until our eyes adjusted to the moonlight. "I don't see anything," Mike said after a minute. "Wait," Jason said, his voice tight. "There it is." I saw it then too, movement behind the tree, something shifting in the shadows, something large. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Nobody move," I whispered, reaching slowly for my camera on the back seat. "Nobody make a sound." The four of us sat frozen, barely breathing, staring at that spot. For maybe 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly it moved. It happened so fast, I almost couldn't process it. Something enormous darted from behind the tree, crossed the road in maybe 2 huge strides, and disappeared into the brush on the other side. It was just a dark shape, a silhouette against the moonlit road, but it was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall and bulky. The movement wasn't like a human running. It was too fluid, too fast, covering too much ground with each step. "Holy shit," Mike whispered. His skepticism had vanished. "Holy shit, holy shit." "Did anyone see its face?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I did," Donna said. Her voice was so quiet I could barely hear her. "I saw its eyes." "What did they look like?" Jason asked. They were huge, she said, and they were so high up, way higher than a person's would be. They reflected the moonlight like an animal's eyes do at night. I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned white. Did anyone else notice that? I asked. Notice what? Jason asked. The smell, right when it crossed the road. They all nodded. It was unmistakable, a powerful musky odor, like wet animal fur mixed with something rotten. The smell lingered in the air, wafting through our open windows. That's the signature Bigfoot smell, I said, my voice cracking with a mixture of terror and excitement. Witnesses always mention it. What do we do now? Mike asked. His earlier skepticism seemed like a distant memory. We go after it, I said immediately, though my body was screaming at me to turn the car around and get the hell out of there. I flicked the headlights back on and eased the car forward to where the creature had crossed. We stopped right in the middle of the road and all got out, hesitantly, looking around constantly, staying close to the car. The smell was stronger here, so strong it made my eyes water. I trained my flashlight on the ground where I thought the creature had stepped. The dirt road was hard-packed, but on the edge where it transitioned to vegetation, there was a softer patch. And there, unmistakably, was a footprint. It was huge, at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide. It wasn't a clear print like you see in photographs, more of a depression, but the basic foot shape was visible. 5 toes, a wide ball, a narrow heel. Someone get the plaster, I said, my voice shaking. Quick, before it rains or something. Jason ran back to the car and grabbed the plaster of Paris kit. We hurriedly mixed it with some water from our bottle and poured it into the depression. While we waited for it to set, we searched the area for more prints or evidence. That's when we heard it. From the direction the creature had gone came a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started as a low grumbling, almost like a large dog, but dropped even lower, becoming more of a vibration you could feel in your chest than an actual sound. Then it rose into a howl that sent ice down my spine, not like a wolf, not like any animal I knew. It was deeper, more powerful, and there was something almost deliberate about it, like speech, but not language as we know it. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing around until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before fading away. We all looked at each other, frozen in place. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Back to the car, I finally whispered. Now! We didn't run. Somehow that felt dangerous, like it might trigger a chase response, but we walked quickly, eyes darting in all directions. The forest around us suddenly seemed alive with potential threats. Every shadow looked like it might contain that massive silhouette. Once inside, I locked all the doors and started the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. "Should we leave?" Donna asked, her voice small. Part of me wanted to say yes, to floor it, and not stop until we were back in Orlando with lights and people and civilization. But another part of me, the part that had been searching for this evidence for years, couldn't just walk away. "Let's drive down the road a bit further," I said. "Just to the power line corridor. If we see it again, we'll get better photos. If not, we'll come back tomorrow in daylight." No one objected, though I could feel the tension in the car. I drove slowly down the road, all of us scanning the forest on both sides. The smell had faded, but occasionally wafted back through the windows when the breeze shifted. After about a quarter mile, we reached the power line corridor, a wide swath cut through the forest where high-tension lines ran in straight lines across the landscape. The moonlight made the clearing glow with an eerie, pale light. I stopped the car at the edge of the corridor and turned off the engine again. "Listen," I said. In the distance, we could hear something moving through the underbrush, branches snapping, vegetation being pushed aside. Whatever it was big, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. "It's following the corridor," Jason whispered, pointing to the right, where the sounds were coming from. I grabbed my camera and stepped out of the car, ignoring the hissed warnings from my friends. The power line corridor stretched away into the darkness, maybe 100 feet wide, with the forest walling it in on both sides. The sounds were coming from the edge of the tree line, moving parallel to the corridor. I raised my camera, switched it to night vision mode, and peered through the viewfinder. The green-tinted image showed the grassy corridor and the dark mass of trees, but nothing else. The sounds continued: snap, crack, rustle, moving steadily along the edge of the forest. Then it stepped out. For a moment, just a brief, heart-stopping moment, it stood at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by a large bush, but clearly visible in my camera's night vision. It was enormous, covered in dark hair or fur, with a massive upper body that tapered to a narrower waist and long arms that hung below its knees. Its head sat directly on its shoulders, with almost no visible neck. I was so shocked I couldn't press the shutter button. For maybe 2 seconds, it stood there, seemingly looking in our direction, though I couldn't clearly see its face through the foliage, and then it simply stepped back into the forest and was gone. The sounds of its movement continued, faster now, moving away from us along the edge of the corridor. "Did you get it?" Donna asked when I returned to the car, my legs barely able to support me. "No," I said, the biggest regret of my life. "I froze, but I saw it. It was real." We sat there for maybe another hour, hoping it would return, but the forest had gone silent. Eventually, reluctantly, we decided to head back. Before leaving, we collected the plaster cast, which had hardened nicely, capturing what I was now certain was a genuine Bigfoot print. The drive back to Orlando was almost completely silent. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd seen. I kept replaying those few seconds when the creature had stood at the edge of the tree line, its massive silhouette, the way it moved, the way it seemed to look right at us before disappearing. I've been back to that spot 3 times since then in daylight. I found more broken branches along that same path, and what might be more footprints, though none as clear as the one we cast. The plaster cast sits on my desk now, a constant reminder that what we saw was real. I don't know what to do with this experience. Part of me wants to contact researchers, to go public with our sighting and the cast, but another part of me feels strangely protective of the creature and its territory. Whatever it was, Bigfoot, skunk ape, or something else entirely, it's managed to remain largely hidden despite centuries of human expansion. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay that way, but I know what I saw that night in Fort Christmas, and I'll never look at those Florida forests the same way again. Something is out there, watching from the shadows, moving through the wilderness just beyond the reach of our understanding. Something ancient and powerful that doesn't want to be found, at least not by most of us. Story 4. I've been debating whether to share this for over 10 years now. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and I'm not the type who scares easily. I've always considered myself pretty level-headed, skeptical even. I work in accounting, for crying out loud. My life revolves around verifiable numbers and concrete facts. But what happened on October 27th, 2012 has haunted me ever since, and I need to get it off my chest. My boyfriend Mark and I were driving through Central Florida that weekend. We'd been planning this trip for months, nothing fancy, just a long weekend away from the hustle of Miami, where we lived at the time. Mark had relatives near Orlando we were going to visit, and we'd planned to check out some less touristy spots along the way. I remember being excited about just having uninterrupted time together. His job in IT consulting had him traveling constantly, and my busy season at the accounting firm had just ended. The weather that day was perfect. Warm, but not the brutal heat Florida can get. We'd left Miami around noon, taking our time with the drive. Mark was behind the wheel of his old Honda Civic. The thing had over 200,000 miles on it, but he refused to get rid of it. said it had character. The AC was barely working, so we had the windows down, and I had my feet up on the dashboard, feeling the warm air rush over us. We'd been on the road for about 5 hours, taking detours and stopping at a couple roadside attractions. I remember we'd gotten into a silly argument about 20 minutes before it happened, something about where to stop for dinner, the kind of meaningless bickering couples do on road trips. To be honest, I was still a little annoyed, so I'd retreated to the back seat with my book about an hour before, claiming I wanted to stretch out. Really, I just needed some space. Mark had the radio on, playing some indie rock station that was starting to break up as we got further from the city. It was around 6 in the evening when we approached the St. John's River crossing on Highway 50. If you've never been, it's this relatively small highway that cuts across the middle of Florida through some pretty remote stretches. Not exactly wilderness, but definitely not developed either. Lots of wetlands, palm trees and scrubby forest. The sun was getting low, casting this golden orange light across everything. The kind of light photographers call the magic hour, where everything looks warm and almost dreamlike. The river itself isn't massive there, but significant enough that the bridge gives you a decent view of the surrounding area for a minute or two as you cross. I wasn't even looking out the window intentionally. I'd just glanced up from my book because the light had changed as we hit the bridge, and my eyes were drawn to the movement on the riverside. At first, I thought it was just someone fishing or maybe kids playing by the water's edge. It took my brain a second to process what I was actually seeing. About 50 yards from the bridge, on the far side of the river, was this figure. Not a human figure, at least not any human I've ever seen. It was walking away from the river's edge toward the tree line, moving with this fluid, rolling gait that immediately struck me as wrong. Not wrong like injured or awkward, but wrong like not human. The thing was huge. I'm terrible with estimating heights, but it was substantially taller than any person I've ever seen. It was uniformly brown, like a dark, muddy chocolate color all over. No clothes, no gear, no variation in color from head to foot that would suggest it was wearing anything. Just this solid, consistent brown. The shape was unmistakably bipedal, walking on 2 legs, but the proportions were off. The arms hung much lower than a human's would, nearly to the knees, and they swung in this exaggerated way with each step. Not like someone pretending to be an ape in a movie, but natural, like that's how its body was designed to move. Its legs seemed longer in relation to its torso than a human's, and there was this massive bulk to its upper body. The shoulders were impossibly wide. What struck me most was how it moved. There was this power and efficiency to it. No wasted motion, no stumbling or adjusting. Just this smooth, deliberate stride that seemed perfectly adapted to its environment. It moved like it belonged there, like the land was made for it, rather than the other way around. I couldn't make out any facial features from that distance and angle. It never turned toward the road. Just kept walking away from the water with this unhurried pace, like it had all the time in the world and knew exactly where it was going. The entire sighting probably lasted less than 10 seconds before trees obscured my view. The bridge ended, and suddenly there was dense vegetation blocking the riverside. I remember my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My palms were instantly sweaty, and I felt this cold rush of adrenaline, but I didn't say anything. Not right away. I just sat there, gripping my book so tightly my knuckles were white, trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to come up with any rational explanation. Was it a bear? No way. I'd seen bears in the wild before on a camping trip to North Carolina. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright like that for extended periods, and the movement was all wrong. Was it someone in a costume? Who would wear a full-body costume in the Florida heat, miles from any town, with no cameras or audience? And no costume I've ever seen moves that naturally. There was nothing jerky or artificial about its movements. Was it some kind of weird optical illusion? A combination of shadows and movement that my brain misinterpreted? Maybe. That's what I tried to tell myself for the next hour as we continued driving. But I knew what I saw. I kept quiet about it until we reached Mark's cousin's place in Christmas, Florida. It's this tiny town east of Orlando. Blink and you miss it. The whole drive there, I was running the image over and over in my head, trying to find some logical explanation. But every time I replayed it, I became more certain of what I'd seen. After we'd settled in, unpacked the car and had some dinner with his cousins, Mark and I finally got a moment alone on the back porch. They had this screened-in lanai overlooking a small pond. The night was warm and the frogs were making a racket. I remember the citronella candles were burning, keeping the mosquitoes at bay, and we were both nursing beers. "I need to tell you something," I finally said, "and you're going to think I'm crazy." Mark looked at me with that patient half smile he always had when I was being dramatic about something. "Try me." "When we were crossing that bridge earlier, over the St. Johns River, I saw something." I paused, already feeling ridiculous. "I think I saw a Sasquatch." I expected him to laugh, or at least give me that look he does when he thinks I'm being silly. Instead, his expression turned serious. "What exactly did you see?" he asked, his voice lowered even though we were alone. So I told him everything. The height, the color, the movement, the proportions, how it walked away from the river with that strange fluid stride. How certain I was that it wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I could explain. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, just staring at his beer bottle, picking at the label with his thumbnail. "You don't believe me," I said. It wasn't a question. "It's not that I don't believe you saw something," he replied carefully. "But you have to admit, Olivia, it sounds crazy, I know. Not crazy, just unlikely. There are a lot of weird things in Florida. Could have been a really tall person. Or maybe some kind of wildlife you're not familiar with." "Mark, I know what I saw. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever seen or heard of," he sighed. "Well, what do you want to do about it? Go back and look for tracks? Report it to someone?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. Who would I even report something like this to? The local sheriff? They'd think I was insane or attention-seeking, some cryptozoology website. I'd always scoffed at those kinds of things before. "I don't know," I admitted. "I just needed to tell someone, to say it out loud." The conversation kind of died after that. Mark didn't dismiss me outright, but I could tell he thought I'd just seen something ordinary and misinterpreted it. We finished our beers in awkward silence and went to bed early, blaming the long drive. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure again, moving with that impossible grace into the tree line. I kept replaying the sighting, examining every detail I could remember. The way the muscles in its back shifted beneath that brown skin, fur. I couldn't tell from the distance. The slight hunch to its shoulders, the casual confidence of its stride. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and got my laptop. I started searching for similar sightings in the area. To my surprise, there were quite a few reports from Central Florida, most in the Ocala National Forest, which isn't far from where we were. People described similar creatures, tall, brown, moving with unexpected grace for their size. One report in particular sent chills down my spine. A truck driver claimed to have seen something crossing Highway 50 near the St. Johns River just a year earlier, describing almost exactly what I had seen. Same location, same description, same unnerving, natural movement. I must have fallen asleep eventually because Mark woke me up around 9 the next morning. My laptop was still open beside me, the battery dead. The whole next day, I felt on edge. We went through the motions of visiting with his family, drove around the area a bit, got lunch at some local place his cousin recommended. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. That evening, I convinced Mark to drive back to the bridge. I told him I wanted to see the sunset over the river, which wasn't entirely a lie. He was reluctant. It was a 40-minute drive from his cousin's place, but eventually agreed. We arrived around 6:30, almost exactly 24 hours after my sighting. Mark pulled the car onto the shoulder just past the bridge, and we walked back to look over the railing. The light was similar to the day before, that same golden glow making everything look slightly surreal. "Where exactly did you see it?" Mark asked, his tone gentler than the night before. I pointed to the far bank, to a spot where a small clearing met the tree line. There. It was walking from the water's edge toward those trees. We stood there for nearly an hour, watching the sun go down, seeing nothing but a few birds and the occasional splash of a fish in the water. Part of me had hoped, irrationally, that the creature would return, that Mark would see it too, and I'd be vindicated. But the riverside remained empty of anything unusual. As we were about to leave, an older man pulled up behind our car in a beat-up pickup truck. He had a fishing pole sticking out of the bed and looked like he was setting up to do some evening fishing. Local, obviously. Before I could stop myself, I approached him. "Excuse me, sir? Can I ask you something?" He looked up from his tackle box, squinting at me suspiciously. "What's that? Have you ever seen anything strange around here? By the river, I mean." The man's expression changed subtly. Not alarmed exactly, but more guarded. "Strange how?" I hesitated, feeling Mark's eyes on my back. "Like something you couldn't explain. Something that didn't seem normal." The old man studied me for a long moment, then shut his tackle box with a definitive click. "Look, miss, I've been fishing these waters for 40 years. There's all kinds of things in these woods. Some things it's better not to go looking for." "So you have seen something?" I pressed. He shook his head. "I didn't say that. Just saying some stories aren't meant to be chased down. This area's got history, old history. Indigenous folks had tales about this river and what lives near it. Tales that go back hundreds of years." He reached into his truck and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with a worn Zippo. "Me, I mind my business. Fish in the daylight. Stay away after dark. That's all I'm saying." With that, he turned his back on us, clearly done with the conversation. Mark gently pulled me away, back to our car. "Happy now?" he asked as we got in. "You've got the local cryptid expert weighing in." "He knows something," I insisted. "Did you see how he reacted when I asked?" "Liv, he's probably just humoring the tourists. Or he's got some moonshine operation back in those woods. He doesn't want people snooping around." Maybe Mark was right. But the man's reaction had seemed genuine to me, not like someone making up stories or protecting a secret still, but like someone who knew exactly what I was asking about and didn't want to acknowledge it. We drove back to his cousin's place, mostly in silence. I could tell Mark was getting frustrated with my obsession, but I couldn't let it go. That night, I spent hours reading more accounts online. People who claimed to have encountered similar creatures all over Florida. Some stories seemed exaggerated or clearly fabricated, but others rang true in a way I couldn't explain. The rest of our weekend passed uneventfully. We drove back to Miami on Sunday, taking a different route that avoided the St. Johns River crossing. Within a week, life had mostly returned to normal. Work picked back up, Mark and I settled into our routine, and I stopped bringing up what I'd seen. Not because I'd changed my mind, but because I could see it was creating tension between us. But I never forgot. Not for a day. Sometimes I'd be sitting at my desk at work, staring at spreadsheets, and the image would flash through my mind, that tall, brown figure moving with inhuman grace toward the tree line. I'd feel that same cold rush of adrenaline, that same tightening in my chest. Mark and I broke up about 6 months later. There were other reasons, of course, relationship problems that had been building for a while. But I sometimes wonder if what happened that day was the beginning of the end for us. Not because of what I saw, but because of how differently we processed it. How he couldn't or wouldn't believe that I'd encountered something beyond ordinary explanation. It's been over 10 years now. I've moved away from Florida, built a new life. I've told very few people about what I saw that day. Most react like Mark did, polite disbelief wrapped in concern. Some try to convince me it was a bear or a person or a trick of the light. Others just think I'm making it up for attention, but I know what I saw by the St. John's River that October evening. I know it wasn't human. I know it wasn't any known animal. And in my darkest, quietest moments, I sometimes wonder if I had called out, would it have turned around? Would I have seen its face? And would I be better off now, never knowing what those eyes might have looked like, staring back at me from across the water? Story 5. It's been 3 months since that day at Rock Springs Run, and I still can't shake the feeling we were being watched the entire time. I've avoided talking about it until now, because I was worried people would think we're crazy. But after reading some of your experiences here, I feel like this might be the one place where someone will actually believe what happened to us. My wife Jennifer and I moved to Central Florida from California about 6 months ago. We're both in our early 30s and had spent years hiking all over California. Yosemite, Joshua Tree, the Redwoods, you name it. We thought we knew what to expect from nature. We were wrong. People kept telling us that Florida has its own kind of wilderness, totally different from what we were used to out west. They weren't kidding. It's like a different planet here. The humidity, the insects, the way the light filters through the trees. Everything just feels different. More alive somehow, but also more hidden. We'd been wanting to explore some real Florida, as the locals call it, and last Saturday seemed perfect. Mid-70s, lower humidity than usual, and finally a weekend when neither of us was swamped with work from the move. We decided on Rock Springs Run State Reserve after reading it had good trails and wasn't usually crowded. The moment we turned onto that dirt access road, I felt something change. It's hard to explain. The air got heavier, not just from humidity, but like there was some kind of pressure pushing in on us. Jennifer didn't seem to notice at first. She was busy pointing out the moss hanging from the oak trees and getting excited about seeing her first armadillo crossing the road. We parked in a small clearing where the road ended, maybe half a mile in. There was one other car there when we arrived, but as we were grabbing our backpacks, an older couple came out of the trail, got in that car, and left. Just like that, we had the whole place to ourselves. "Perfect!" Jennifer said, adjusting her hat. "No crowds to deal with." I didn't say anything, but I remember thinking it was weird that a place this beautiful would be completely empty on a perfect Saturday afternoon. But hey, we weren't complaining. We double-checked our day packs, water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, map, and the emergency whistle Jennifer always insists on bringing. I also had my phone for pictures, though the signal had disappeared about a quarter-mile back on the dirt road. The first half hour was exactly what we'd hoped for. The main trail was wide and relatively dry, with thick palmetto bushes lining both sides. We spotted at least a dozen vultures circling overhead, which Jennifer kept photographing. I remember joking that they were just waiting for some tourist to get lost and die of dehydration. "Don't even joke about that," she said, but she was smiling. Then we saw the deer, 4 of them, about 50 yards away, just standing there watching us. They didn't run like deer usually do. They just stared for way too long. Then they all turned at exactly the same moment and disappeared into the brush. "That was weird," Jennifer whispered. "Do Florida deer always act like that?" I shrugged it off, but it bothered me more than I let on. About an hour in, we came to a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight, but there was a narrower trail that dipped down into what looked like slightly lower terrain. The smaller path had these beautiful wildflowers alongside it. so we decided to check it out. Big mistake. The trail descended gradually, and the vegetation changed. The palmettos gave way to taller ferns, and the ground became increasingly soggy. Our hiking boots were good, but even they couldn't keep all the moisture out after a while. The mosquitoes got worse too, despite the repellent we'd applied. "Michael, I don't like this," Jennifer said after we'd gone about a quarter mile down this trail. "Look at how the ground is getting." She was right. What had started as just damp soil was turning into actual standing water in places. The trail ahead looked even wetter. "Yeah, let's turn back," I agreed. "I don't fancy slogging through a swamp today." As we turned around, I heard something splash off to our right, maybe 30 yards into the thick vegetation. Something big. "Did you hear that?" I asked Jennifer. She nodded, eyes wide. "Alligator." "Probably," I said, though it sounded heavier than what I'd imagine an alligator would make. "Let's get back to the main trail." We picked up our pace, not quite running, but definitely moving faster than a casual walk. The whole area suddenly felt oppressive. The canopy overhead seemed to block more light than before, and the air felt thick with moisture and the smell of decaying vegetation. When we finally reached the main trail again, we both let out audible sighs of relief. We stopped to drink some water and catch our breath. "I think we should stick to the main path from now on," Jennifer said, and I quickly agreed. We continued along for another 20 minutes or so, the trail now heading somewhat uphill and away from the wetter areas. The woods around us seemed to quiet down. Even the birds had stopped calling. That should have been our second warning. That's when we heard it for the first time. Knock, knock, knock! 3 distinct, powerful sounds, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat. It came from somewhere to our right, maybe a few hundred yards into the forest. "What was that?" Jennifer asked, freezing in place. "Probably a woodpecker," I said, though I knew damn well it wasn't. The sound was too loud, too deliberate. "That's no woodpecker, Michael." We stood still, listening. The forest remained silent for maybe 30 seconds. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Same rhythm, same volume, same direction. "Could be hunters," Jennifer suggested. "Maybe," I said, though it seemed unlikely. We hadn't seen any hunting permitted signs, and why would hunters be knocking on trees? We started walking again, but slower now, both of us straining to hear. That's when things got truly unsettling. From the opposite direction, maybe a quarter mile away to our left, came an answering series of knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I saw Jennifer's face go pale. "Michael, I heard it." We stopped again, and the first source responded almost immediately. Knock, knock, but this time it added a fourth, knock. Without missing a beat, the second source replied with the exact same pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 4th knock. "They're communicating," Jennifer whispered, grabbing my arm. "What the hell is doing that?" I tried to think of a rational explanation. Maybe it's park rangers, some kind of signal system they use. Even as I said it, I knew it made no sense. We hadn't seen a single park employee all day. There were no vehicles at the trailhead, except ours, and there were definitely no trails leading off in the directions of either sound, just thick, nearly impenetrable Florida wilderness. We stood frozen in place as the exchange continued. The patterns changed, sometimes 2 knocks, sometimes 4, sometimes with different timing between them. But always, one would knock and the other would respond with the exact same pattern. "We need to leave," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "Now." I nodded. We turned and started walking back toward the parking area, trying not to make it obvious we were retreating. I don't know why, but something told me we shouldn't run or show fear, that it would be dangerous. The knocking continued behind us, but now the patterns were changing more rapidly. They seemed more urgent somehow. "Don't look back," I told Jennifer, though I'm not sure why I said it. We maintained a brisk walk, not running but moving as quickly as we could, without making too much noise. The parking area was maybe half a mile away. That's when I felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. I fought the urge to turn around. Jennifer must have felt it too because she squeezed my hand hard. The knocking had stopped. The silence was somehow worse. We were maybe a quarter mile from the car when we heard movement in the brush to our right. Not knocking anymore. Actual movement. Something large pushing through the dense vegetation. The palmetto fronds swayed about 50 yards off the trail. "Stay calm," I whispered to Jennifer. "Keep walking." The movement paralleled us, keeping pace. Whatever it was following the trail just inside the tree line. I still couldn't see anything clearly, just occasional movement of vegetation, a dark shape that never fully revealed itself. Then we heard it from the left side too, the same kind of movement keeping pace with us from the other side of the trail. "They're flanking us," Jennifer said, her voice barely audible. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We were being herded down the trail like some kind of prey. I fought the compulsion to break into a run, knowing instinctively that would be the wrong move. The trail curved to the right, and as we rounded the bend, something large crossed the path about 100 yards ahead of us. It was so quick I couldn't make out details, just a dark, massive shape moving with surprising speed from right to left across the trail, disappearing into the vegetation. Jennifer saw it too. She stopped dead in her tracks. "Michael." "I know. Keep moving. We're almost there." That's when the knocking started again, but different this time. Not the measured, deliberate knocks from before. This was faster, more urgent, and it was coming from all around us now. Not just two locations, but what sounded like 3 or 4 different sources. We picked up our pace, no longer caring if whatever was out there knew we were frightened. The car was maybe 1/5 of a mile away now. The knocking intensified, getting louder and faster. Then from somewhere behind us came a sound that still haunts my dreams. Not a knock this time, a howl or a scream. I don't know how to describe it. It started low and rose in pitch, lasting maybe 5 seconds. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard either. That's when we ran. All pretense of calm was gone. We sprinted down that trail like our lives depended on it, because I truly believe they did. The vegetation on both sides of the trail erupted with movement. They were running too, keeping pace with us just out of sight. I caught glimpses of dark shapes moving through the trees, always just at the edge of clear visibility. Jennifer was ahead of me now, running flat out. I could hear her breathing in harsh gasps. The parking area came into view, our car sitting alone in the clearing, exactly as we'd left it. The knocking had stopped, but the movement hadn't. Whatever was following us had spread out, forming what felt like a semicircle behind us. We reached the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the unlock button. The locks clicked, and we threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut. For a moment we just sat there, gasping for breath, the windows still rolled up despite the heat. I started the engine with trembling hands and threw the car into reverse, wheels spinning on the dirt as I backed up to turn around. As I was turning the car, Jennifer grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "Michael, look," she whispered. At the edge of the clearing, just where the trail entered the woods, stood a figure. It was partially obscured by a large oak tree, but I could make out enough to know this was no human. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, its massive frame covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I had the distinct impression it was watching us intently. I hit the gas pedal and sped down the dirt road, not caring about the ruts or branches scraping against the car. Neither of us spoke until we reached the main paved road and turned toward civilization. "Did you see it?" Jennifer finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, "I saw it." "What was it, Michael?" I shook my head. "I don't know." But that's not entirely true. I think I do know. I just don't want to say it out loud, because saying it makes it real. We haven't been hiking since that day. We've told a few friends about hearing weird noises in the state park, but not the full story. They'd think we were crazy. Hell, sometimes I wonder if we are. But then I remember the knocking, the way they communicated, the way they coordinated to herd us down that trail, the intelligence behind those actions. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. They were hunting us, deliberately, methodically. I've been researching similar encounters in Florida, and I'm not the only one who's experienced something like this. But most people don't talk about it, would you? I still have nightmares about that figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Sometimes in the dreams, it steps fully into view, and I wake up screaming before I can see its face. We're thinking about moving back to California. Story 6. I still don't know how to make sense of what happened that day in May. It's been 3 months, and I still find myself checking over my shoulder when I'm outside, especially when I'm near any kind of wooded area. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever, but what I saw that day wasn't normal. It wasn't human. I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. So me and 3 of my friends, Kyle, Marcus, and Dave, had this brilliant idea to go camping for the weekend. We're all in our mid-20s, working jobs we don't particularly love in Tampa, and we needed to get away. Marcus suggested this spot he knew about outside this tiny town called Cypress Creek, about an hour and a half north of the city. It's not an official campground or anything, just this patch of land near a canal that runs through the area. The land isn't exactly public, but it's not actively monitored either, if you know what I mean. We got there around 2 in the afternoon. The weather was perfect. Not too hot for Florida in May, maybe around 80 degrees with a nice breeze. The spot was pretty much as Marcus described it, a flat area of land near the canal, with trees on one side providing some shade, and this massive dirt embankment on the other side, probably left over from when they dug the canal. This thing was steep, I'd guess around 20 feet high, and almost vertical in some spots. The cool thing about where we set up was that we had this great view across this open field on the other side of our little camp area. It was just flat land, with some tall grass and wildflowers, stretching maybe a couple 100 yards before hitting another tree line. We started unloading our stuff from Marcus's pickup and my Subaru. Kyle and Dave were arguing about the best way to set up the tents, and I was unpacking the cooler with our beer and food when I noticed something in the field. At first I thought it was just someone walking through, maybe a hunter or another camper, and I remember thinking we might get in trouble for camping there without permission. But then I actually focused on what I was seeing, and I froze. This wasn't a person. I mean, it was walking on 2 legs like a person. But it was all wrong. It was tall, way taller than any person I've ever seen. 6.5 feet at minimum, maybe closer to 7. And it was covered in this shaggy brown hair or fur, head to toe, not clothes, actual hair growing out of its body. The thing that really got me, though, were its arms. They hung down almost to its knees, swinging slightly as it moved. The proportions were just off, like someone had taken a human form and stretched it all wrong. "Guys," I said, but it came out as barely a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again, louder. "Guys!" They must have heard something in my voice because they all stopped what they were doing and looked at me. I just pointed, and they turned to look where I was pointing. "What the hell is that?" Dave whispered. We all just stood there watching this creature as it moved across the field. It was walking at first, but then suddenly it broke into a sprint, and holy shit, the speed was unbelievable. It covered ground faster than any person I've ever seen run. It didn't look like it was even trying that hard either. Its movements were fluid and natural, like that's just how it moved normally. Then it stopped dead, about 100 yards from us. It just stopped and turned in our direction. I couldn't make out its face clearly at that distance, but I could tell it was looking right at us. I felt this cold sensation crawl up my spine. It wasn't just that we were seeing it, it was seeing us too, watching us. And we had no idea what its intentions were, We all stood completely still. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. I was barely breathing. The creature just stood there, staring in our direction for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Then it did something that I still can't explain. It turned and ran directly toward the embankment. You know, that steep dirt wall next to our camp. It hit that near vertical slope at full speed, and instead of slowing down or struggling, it just ran up it, straight up like the laws of physics didn't apply to it. Its arms and legs moved in this coordinated way, and it scaled that 20-foot embankment in seconds without breaking stride. At the top, it stopped again and turned back toward us. This time I could see it a little better since it was elevated and closer. It was silhouetted against the sky, this massive, hairy figure just standing there, looking down at us. Then it turned and disappeared over the other side. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than a minute from start to finish, but it felt like time had slowed down. "What the actual fuck was that?" Kyle finally said, breaking the silence. We all started talking at once. Marcus thought it was a bear, but I've seen bears, and they don't run on two legs like that. Dave was convinced it was just some guy in a costume playing a prank. But no human could move that fast or climb that embankment that way. It was physically impossible. "Should we leave?" I asked, but nobody seemed eager to make that decision. We had driven all this way, set up most of our camp already, and despite what we'd seen, there was still daylight, and the creature had gone away from us, not toward us. "Let's just stay alert," Marcus suggested. "Maybe it was just checking us out, and now it'll leave us alone." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't push it. Part of me wanted to rationalize what I'd seen, to find some explanation that made sense in the world as I understood it. But there was another part of me, a more primitive part, that was sending alarm signals throughout my body. We finished setting up camp, but the mood had changed. We kept looking over at the embankment, half expecting to see that thing appear at the top again. We talked about what we'd seen, going back and forth between serious theories and nervous jokes. Kyle pulled out his phone to Google Bigfoot, Florida, but of course there was no signal. As the sun started to set, we got a fire going and broke out the beers. The alcohol helped calm our nerves a bit, and after a while, we managed to talk about other things. But every time there was a rustle in the bushes or a snap of a twig, we'd all tense up and go quiet, scanning the growing darkness around us. Around 8 o'clock, when it was fully dark except for our campfire, we heard something moving around in the trees behind us, the opposite direction from where we'd seen the creature earlier. Marcus shined his flashlight in that direction, but we couldn't see anything. "Probably just raccoons or something," Dave said, but he didn't sound convinced. We decided to take shifts staying awake that night. No one wanted to admit it, but none of us felt comfortable with all of us sleeping at once. I took the first watch while the others got into their tents. I sat by the fire, trying to keep it going, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. The normal nighttime noises of the woods, insects, frogs from the canal, the occasional rustle of small animals, suddenly seemed sinister. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. About an hour into my watch, I heard a sound from the direction of the embankment, a sort of sliding, shuffling noise. I turned my flashlight in that direction but couldn't see anything. The beam only reached so far, and beyond that was just darkness. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like something large moving through the tall grass that grew along the base of the embankment. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to wake the others, but I was afraid that any sudden movement or noise from me might provoke whatever was out there. So I sat completely still, willing my breath to be silent, my flashlight aimed in the direction of the sound. And then I saw them, two eyes reflecting the light about 30 yards away, near the bottom of the embankment. They were positioned too high off the ground to be any normal animal. They had to be at least 6 feet up. I very slowly reached for the hunting knife Marcus had left next to the cooler. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it made me feel slightly less helpless. The eyes continued to stare at me, unblinking, unmoving. And then they were gone, just like that. No sound of retreat, no movement that I could detect, just there one moment and gone the next. I sat there for another 20 minutes, scanning the darkness, before I finally relaxed enough to wake up Kyle for his shift. "I think it's out there," I whispered to him as he crawled out of his tent. I saw eyes watching me from near the embankment. Kyle looked nervous, but nodded. "I'll keep an eye out, try to get some sleep." Sleep, right. As if that was going to happen, I lay in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, listening for any sound that might indicate the creature was getting closer. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and sunlight was filtering through the tent fabric. When I emerged from my tent, Marcus and Dave were already up, making coffee on the camp stove. Kyle was passed out in a camping chair, apparently having fallen asleep during his watch. "Anything happen while I was asleep?" I asked. Marcus shook his head. "Not that we know of. Kyle's been out for at least an hour, though." I felt relief wash over me. Maybe we had just scared ourselves. Maybe what we'd seen yesterday was, well, I still had no explanation for what it could have been, but at least it seemed to have left us alone during the night. We had breakfast and decided to go for a hike along the canal. The idea was to get a better look at the area in daylight, maybe find some evidence of what we'd seen. None of us explicitly said we were looking for Bigfoot tracks or whatever, but I think we were all hoping for something that would either confirm what we saw or give us a rational explanation for it. The canal was pretty, with clear water and lots of small fish visible from the banks. Under different circumstances, it would have been a relaxing walk. But we were all on edge, constantly scanning the trees and the field on the other side of the canal. About a mile from our camp, Marcus stopped suddenly. "Look at that," he said, pointing to the ground near the water. We gathered around to look. There, in the soft mud along the canal bank, was a footprint, a very large footprint. It was roughly human-shaped, but much bigger, at least 15 inches long and proportionally wide. And there was something else strange about it. The toes. They weren't like human toes. They were longer, almost like fingers, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. We all stared at it in silence. This was real evidence that something unusual was in the area. Not conclusive proof of what we'd seen, but definitely not normal. "Could be a bear," Dave suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. The print was clearly bipedal, not like a bear's paw at all. We found a few more prints farther along, leading away from the canal and toward the tree line. They were spaced far apart, suggesting whatever made them had a long stride. "Let's follow them," Kyle suggested, and though part of me thought this was a terrible idea, another part of me needed to know. So we did. The tracks led us into the woods, which were denser than they had appeared from a distance. The ground was covered in pine needles and leaves, making the tracks harder to follow, but occasionally we'd find a clear print in a patch of soft earth, or a broken branch that seemed to indicate something large had passed through. The farther we went, the more uneasy I felt. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. It was like every animal in the area was hiding or had fled. After about 20 minutes of tracking, the prints led us to a small clearing. And there, in the middle of the clearing, was something that made us all stop in our tracks. It was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. The animal had been torn apart, its ribcage exposed, most of the meat stripped from the bones. But it wasn't the dead deer that was most disturbing, it was how it had been arranged. The carcass was positioned carefully, the remaining limbs stretched out in specific directions, the head placed a few feet away, facing the body. This wasn't just a kill site, it looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Let's get the fuck out of here," Dave said, and none of us argued. We backtracked as quickly as we could, no longer caring about following the prints or being quiet. When we finally reached the canal again, we all breathed a collective sigh of relief. "We should pack up and leave," I said, and this time everyone agreed. We practically ran back to the campsite, the sense of being watched never leaving us. When we reached our camp, we started packing up immediately, not even bothering to eat lunch first. As I was taking down my tent, I happened to glance toward the embankment, and that's when I saw it again. The creature was standing at the top, in broad daylight, watching us. This time, I could see it clearly. It was exactly as I'd first seen it, impossibly tall, covered in long brown fur, with those unnaturally long arms. But now I could make out more details. Its face was almost human-like, but not quite. A prominent brow ridge, deep-set eyes that looked too intelligent, a flat nose, and a mouth that seemed perpetually drawn into a grimace, showing teeth that were definitely not human. "Guys!" I said, my voice cracking. They all turned to look, and I heard Marcus swear under his breath. The creature just stood there watching us. It didn't seem aggressive, but it wasn't afraid either. It was studying us. I got the distinct impression that it was as curious about us as we were terrified of it. Then, just like before, it suddenly moved, but this time it came down the embankment, sliding and jumping with that same impossible agility. It landed at the bottom and stood there, now only about 50 yards from us. We were all frozen in place. I remember thinking that running would be pointless. This thing could outrun any of us without breaking a sweat. So we just stood there, staring at it, and it stared back. And then it made a sound, a sort of low, rumbling vocalization that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't speech either. It raised one of its long arms, and I swear to God, it pointed directly at the remains of our campfire, then at us, then back at the fire. "Is it trying to communicate?" Kyle whispered. Before any of us could respond, the creature suddenly tensed, its head snapping to look toward the canal. We heard it then too, the sound of a boat engine approaching. The creature looked back at us for just a second, and then it was gone, sprinting across the field with that same unbelievable speed we'd seen the day before. By the time the boat came into view around the bend in the canal, the creature had vanished into the distant tree line. We finished packing in record time and got the hell out of there. The entire drive back to Tampa, we barely spoke. What was there to say? We had all seen it. We all knew what we had experienced wasn't normal. When I got back to my apartment that evening, I immediately started researching. I found reports of similar sightings in Florida, not as many as in the Pacific Northwest, but enough to make me realize we weren't the only ones. Some people call it the Florida skunk ape instead of Bigfoot, but the descriptions match what we saw. I keep thinking about how it pointed at our fire, then at us. Was it trying to tell us something? Warning us? Threatening us? Or was it simply curious about humans and their strange habits, like starting fires? I don't know, and I may never know. But I do know that when I'm in bed at night and I hear something moving outside my window, I wonder if it followed me home. I wonder if it's still out there, watching, curious about the strange creatures it encountered that weekend in May. And I wonder what would have happened if that boat hadn't come by when it did. Story 7. I never thought I'd be sharing this online. For years, I kept it between family and a few trusted neighbors, mostly because I didn't want to be labeled the crazy Everglades guy. But after seeing more stories pop up that mirror what we experienced, I think it's time to put this out there. This all happened back in the mid-90s, when my wife and I owned about 12 acres near the edge of the Everglades in Florida. Beautiful property. We had a double-wide trailer set up, 4 horses, some hogs, chickens, and about 2 acres of fruit trees. We had mangoes, guavas, papayas, bananas, you name it. Living that close to the swamp, we expected wildlife. Raccoons, opossums, even the occasional black bear. What we weren't expecting was what locals called skunk apes, It started innocently enough. I noticed fruit missing from our trees. At first, it was just a few mangoes here, a couple papayas there. I blamed raccoons, maybe some birds. But then entire trees started getting stripped overnight. I'm talking about 30 to 40 pounds of fruit vanishing. Even the bananas growing 15 feet up were disappearing. No raccoon or bird I know can reach that high without leaving marks on the trunk. I started staying up later, sitting on the porch with a beer, watching the tree line. That's when I first heard the sounds. Not like anything native to Florida. Deep, throaty vocalizations, somewhere between a whoop and a grunt. Sometimes they'd start low, then rise in pitch. Other times they were short, sharp sounds that seemed to bounce between different parts of the property. Our horses noticed them before we did. That was the first real warning sign. We had 4 horses, 2 quarter horses, a paint, and an older Arabian. They'd get spooked at night, stomping and pacing in their paddock. My wife Laura kept saying they were just hearing coyotes, but I'd been around horses my whole life. This wasn't normal predator anxiety. They were terrified of something specific. The night everything changed was in August. Must have been around the middle of the month. Hot as hell, even at night. We were sleeping with the windows open because our AC was on the fritz. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to this breathing, heavy, rhythmic breathing right outside our bedroom window. The window was about 7 feet off the ground. I nudged Laura awake, put my finger to my lips. The breathing continued, in, out, not like a dog panting, deeper, more controlled. I slowly reached for the flashlight we kept by the bed and clicked it on, pointing it toward the window. I'll never forget what I saw. A face, broad, flattish, with deep-set eyes that caught the light. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The nose was wide and flat, and there was hair, lots of it, framing the face. When the light hit those eyes, they reflected back amber yellow, like a cat's, but larger, much larger. I yelled and jumped up. The face instantly disappeared. By the time I grabbed my rifle from the closet and made it outside, whatever it was had vanished. But the ground beneath our window showed indentations, like something heavy had been standing there. Laura was shaking when I came back in. "What the hell was that, Sam?" she kept asking. I didn't have an answer that made sense. I told her it must have been a bear standing on its hind legs, but I knew better. Bears don't peer curiously into windows 7 feet off the ground, and they don't have faces that look almost human. After that night, things escalated quickly. We started hearing chattering sounds from the woods, not just the whoops and grunts, but what sounded like communication. Different pitches, different rhythms, answers to calls. Sometimes these exchanges would go on for 20 minutes or more. We stopped letting our dogs out at night. We had 2 German shepherds, Max and Duke, and they became absolutely useless as guard dogs. At the first sound from the woods, they'd tuck tail and hide under the porch. These were dogs that would chase off black bears without hesitation. I reinforced the hog pen with extra fencing and put locks on the gates. The chickens got moved closer to the house. I installed motion-activated floodlights around the property. The first night after installing them, they went off 17 times. 17! Each time I'd grab the rifle and go out, but I'd never see anything, just catch glimpses of movement at the edges of the light, or hear rustling retreating into the brush. Then one of our hogs disappeared. 400-pound Hampshire. The gate to its pen wasn't just open. It was bent outward like something had pried it open with enormous strength. We found the hog about 50 yards into the tree line, what was left of it anyway. 3 massive bites had been taken from its side, and the liver was completely gone, while the rest of it was untouched. No animal I know eats just the liver. That's when I started talking to the neighbors. Turned out we weren't the only ones experiencing strange things. The Johnsons, about a mile down the road, had seen shapes moving through their woods at night. Tom Whitaker, who owned the property adjacent to ours, had heard the same vocalizations. Most telling was old Mrs. Belcher, who'd lived in the area for 60 years. She described seeing what she called a gorilla man crossing the road one night, upright on two legs but covered in hair, moving faster than any human could. I started carrying the rifle everywhere. Laura wouldn't go outside alone after dark. We'd lie awake at night, listening to those sounds getting closer and closer to the house. Sometimes I'd hear heavy footsteps on the porch, but by the time I got up and looked out, there'd be nothing there. Just some muddy prints that were too big to be human. The defining moment came in October. I was out checking the fence line at dusk. Probably shouldn't have been, but daylight was running short, and it needed to be done. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder and was about a quarter mile from the house when I heard rustling from a dense patch of palmetto scrub about 30 yards ahead. I froze, watching as the vegetation moved. Then they emerged, not one creature, but three. The first was smaller, maybe 7 feet tall, with reddish-brown hair covering its body. A juvenile, I realized later. Behind it came what I can only describe as Dad. An enormous male, had to be at least 11 or 12 feet tall, with grayish, silvery hair. His arms hung down past his knees, and his face looked weathered, older, with deep creases around the eyes and mouth. The third was female, I'm certain of it. She stood about 8 or 9 feet tall, with a coat that was brownish-gray. Her body shape was different, wider hips, a hint of breasts beneath the hair. She moved with this fluid grace that was unsettling to see in something so large. They didn't see me at first. They moved through my property like they owned it, reaching up into the trees and pulling down fruit. The juvenile would make soft chirping sounds, and the female would respond with similar noises. The big male mostly stayed silent, watching, alert. I stood there paralyzed, not from fear, though there was plenty of that. It was more awe. They were communicating. They were a family. I was watching something that wasn't supposed to exist, and they were acting like any family out on a food-gathering mission. Then the male turned his head and looked directly at me. Our eyes met across that 30 yards, and I knew instantly that he was intelligent. There was awareness there, comprehension. He didn't seem surprised or frightened. He just assessed me, let out a low huff that seemed to signal the others, and then they melted back into the forest. Not running, not panicking, just calmly leaving, like neighbors who'd been caught borrowing something without asking. That night changed everything for me. I stopped seeing them as monsters or animals to be feared. They were something else, intelligent, aware, communicative, and they seemed to be studying us as much as we were trying to understand them. I started leaving fruit out at the edge of the property. It would always be gone by morning. Once I left a bunch of bananas still on the stalk, and the next morning I found it carefully stripped, each banana removed without damaging the stalk itself. No animal does that. My cousin Dale came to stay with us around Thanksgiving. He was a hunter, didn't believe my skunk ape stories, called me crazy right to my face. That is, until we were out checking on the horses one evening and one of the creatures crossed about 50 yards ahead of us. Dale fired a warning shot, damn fool, and I'm pretty sure he grazed its shoulder. The thing stopped, touched the wound with one hand, looked back at us with what I can only describe as annoyed irritation, and then simply walked away into the brush. Didn't run, didn't show pain or fear, just left, like we weren't worth the trouble. Dale didn't call me crazy after that. We had a local deputy out once when we reported the hog incident. He was walking the property line with me when one of them called from the woods, that distinctive whoop grunt. The deputy froze, hand going to his sidearm. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I just shrugged and said, "That's what I've been trying to tell you about." He saw a glimpse of one moving through the trees before he left. Filed a report, but the sheriff's department never followed up. I think they just didn't want to deal with it. The encounters continued through the winter and into spring. They seemed most active on cloudy nights, especially when there was light rain. I tried setting up trail cameras, but they either avoided them completely or, and this happened twice, the cameras would be found carefully placed face down on the ground, undamaged, but obviously moved. I began to notice patterns. They never approached the house when we had visitors. They seemed to know when I had the rifle and when I didn't. Once, Laura forgot to bring in clothes from the line, and the next morning we found them neatly piled on the porch steps, not torn or damaged, stacked, like someone was being helpful. Then, as suddenly as it all began, it stopped. Around May, after a massive wildfire had torn through part of the Everglades, the visits became less frequent. By June, they had stopped altogether. I later found out that plenty of vegetation had regrown in parts of the Everglades that had been previously burned. My theory is they had only moved into our area temporarily while their usual habitat recovered. My last encounter happened during that tapering off period. I was walking a trail on the back of our property, looking for a lost calf. I rounded a bend and nearly walked right into one of them, the female, I think. She was kneeling by some plants, what looked like picking herbs or roots. We were maybe a foot apart before I realized what I was seeing. I froze. She didn't. She just slowly stood up, and up and up. I'd forgotten how tall they were. Looked down at me without any sign of fear or aggression, and walked away. Not into the deep woods, just about 20 feet off the trail, where she continued gathering whatever plants she was collecting. Like I was just another animal she had no reason to fear. I watched her for a while before backing away. She didn't look up again. It's been over 20 years since all this happened. We sold the property in '98 when Laura's mom got sick and we needed to move back to Ohio. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners experienced anything similar, but I've never had the courage to reach out and ask. What would I even say? Hey, just wondering if the family of Bigfoot-like creatures ever came back. I know what I saw. I know what lived alongside us for that year. They were intelligent, they communicated, they had family structures. They weren't monsters or animals. They were something in between, something we don't have a good name for. The locals calling them skunkapes doesn't do them justice. I don't have photos. I don't have proof. But I have the memories of those encounters etched into my brain, the massive footprints in mud, the face at our window, the eyes of that male looking directly into mine with clear intelligence. And sometimes, on rainy nights here in Ohio, I find myself listening for those distinctive calls from the woods behind our house. They never come, of course, but part of me still listens. Story 8. It's been more than 30 years, but I still get goosebumps every time I tell this story. I've kept quiet about it mostly, aside from sharing with a few trusted friends, but I think it's time to put it out there. Maybe someone will read this and know they're not crazy because the same thing happened to them. It was late October of '89, and I was on leave from the army, excited to be back home for our family's annual deer hunting trip in the mountains of Randolph County, West Virginia. I was 24 then, full of energy and not afraid of anything. That was before that day changed everything. We'd set up our usual camp at the base of this secluded mountain. There were 6 of us, my dad, 2 uncles, my cousin, my buddy Mark, who I'd known since high school, and myself. We'd been coming to this same spot for years, but that time something felt different from the moment we arrived. The forest seemed quieter than usual, like the wildlife was keeping to itself. The morning it happened, we started out before sunrise, probably around 5. It was chilly but not freezing, and there was this light mist hanging between the trees that made everything look kind of dreamlike. Dad and my uncles headed northwest. My cousin took the valley route. Mark and I planned to hike up the eastern ridge and then split up to cover more ground. I remember feeling good that morning. Being away from the base and back in these mountains was exactly what I needed. Mark and I hiked for about 2 hours, mostly in silence, just the sound of our boots on the forest floor and our breath clouding in front of us. When we reached the fork in the trail, Mark went right toward a clearing he liked, and I took the left path that climbed higher into the mountain. "Meet back here around 3, Mark said before we split up. I nodded, and adjusted my rifle strap. Good luck. The path I took grew steeper and less defined. After another hour of climbing, I found myself in an area I didn't recognize. I'm not saying I was lost, I had my compass, but I definitely wandered into a section of the mountain we hadn't hunted before. The trees were older here, massive things with trunks wider than a car, and the undergrowth was so thick in spots I had to push through it. Around 9:30, I came across an old tree stand about 15 feet up a huge oak. It looked abandoned, not unsafe, but definitely weathered. Since I hadn't seen any deer sign, and my legs were getting tired from the climb, I decided to climb up and rest there for a bit. The platform was sturdy enough, and I had a good view of a natural clearing below and the slope that continued uphill. I settled in, pulled out a thermos of coffee and some trail mix, and just enjoyed the quiet. The morning sun had burned off the mist, and it was warming up enough that I unzipped my jacket. I remember eating an orange and some apple slices, tossing the peels and cores down below the stand. Looking back, that was probably what attracted what happened next. I must have dozed off, something you're not supposed to do when hunting, but the warm sun and the long hike had made me drowsy. I'm not sure how long I was out, maybe 20 minutes or so. What woke me wasn't a sound, but a smell. It hit me suddenly, this overwhelming stench like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something musky I can't even describe. It made my eyes water. It was so bad. At first, I thought maybe a bear had found a carcass nearby. I sat up slowly and grabbed my rifle, scanning the area below. That's when I saw it, and my blood went cold. About 25 feet downslope from my position stood what I can only describe as a creature. It was small, maybe 5 feet tall, and covered in this long, dark, reddish-brown hair. When I say covered, I mean completely covered, head to toe, in uniform hair about 2 to 3 inches long. It was crouched down, examining the orange peels and apple cores I'd tossed earlier. I froze. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. The way it moved was too deliberate, too human-like. Its hands, and they were hands, not paws, picked up the orange peels almost delicately. I could see fingernails, actual fingernails, not claws. Its feet had defined toes, again, with what looked like thick toenails. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed. The rifle lay across my lap, but I couldn't even think about raising it. Part of me felt like I was still dreaming, but the smell, that horrible smell, told me I was wide awake. Then, something even more terrifying happened. From uphill, maybe 50 yards away, came a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, like someone playing a record backwards, but organic, alive. It was a series of whoops and howls that seemed to have structure, like language. The smaller creature's head snapped up. It stood straight. No, not entirely straight. It had this slight hunch to it, and made a bellowing sound back uphill. They were communicating. I was watching 2 unknown creatures communicating in the middle of the West Virginia wilderness. I gripped the edges of the tree stand so hard, my knuckles went white. Through a gap in the trees, I spotted movement, and then it emerged. A second creature, but this one was massive. It had to be 8 or 9 feet tall, almost black in color, and built like a linebacker, but more muscular. Its arms hung long at its sides, nearly to its knees, and it walked with a slight forward lean. The big one approached the smaller one, still making those backwards record sounds. Its movements were fluid but powerful. Each step covered ground quickly, but there was no awkwardness. This wasn't a man in a suit. Nothing human moves like that. When it reached the smaller one, the interaction was almost familiar. The larger creature made sharp, staccato sounds while gesturing with its massive arms. The smaller one seemed to shrink, lowering its head. It reminded me of a parent scolding a child, as bizarre as that sounds. The smaller one had apparently wandered somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. Then my luck ran out. The smaller creature suddenly looked up. directly at my tree stand. Its eyes, I could see them clearly, were dark but alert, intelligent. It crouched low and kept staring. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might hear it. The smaller one let out a howl that was clearly an alert. The larger creature turned its head, following the smaller one's gaze, and for a moment I found myself staring directly into the face of something science says doesn't exist. Its face was flat, with a pronounced brow ridge. The nose was wide, with round, pronounced nostrils. But it was the eyes that got me. Huge, human-like eyes that held awareness. It raised one arm over its brow, shading its eyes from the sun as it looked up at me. The smaller one didn't wait around. It bolted away through the forest with surprising speed, disappearing into the undergrowth within seconds. But the larger one stood its ground. It didn't seem afraid, just cautious, curious even. Time seemed to stretch. I don't know if we looked at each other for 10 seconds or 2 minutes. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think clearly. All I knew was that I was in the presence of something extraordinary and potentially dangerous. Finally, the creature made a decision. It turned away from me, but not before letting out a low, rumbling sound that I felt more than heard. It walked, not ran, walked away in the same direction the smaller one had gone. Every few yards, it would stop and look back at me, occasionally making that backwards record sound. When it finally disappeared into the trees, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My whole body was shaking. I looked down at my hands and they were trembling so bad I couldn't have fired my rifle if I'd wanted to. I stayed in that tree stand for another hour, too terrified to come down. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me jerking my head around, expecting to see that massive shape again. The smell lingered for a while, then gradually faded. When I finally worked up the courage to climb down, I moved as quietly as I could, constantly scanning the forest around me. I abandoned any thought of hunting and just wanted to get back to the meeting point where Mark would be waiting. I practically ran down the mountain, stumbling more than once, my rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed, though I never saw anything. I reached our meeting spot about an hour early, but Mark was already there, sitting on a fallen log, looking pale. He stood up when he saw me, and I knew immediately something was wrong. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark shook his head slowly. "Not a ghost. I don't know what I saw, but it wasn't a ghost." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What did you see?" "I was in my spot, right? Good visibility watching this small clearing," he said, his voice slightly shaky. "At first I thought it was a bear, this big dark shape moving at the edge of the trees, but then it stood up." "Stood up?" I echoed, though I already knew. "Stood up straight, on 2 legs, like a man, but no man is that big, Ryan." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "It moved like, I don't know, like it belonged there. Smooth, purposeful. It was walking upright through the forest like it owned the place." I sank down onto the log beside him. "I saw it too," I admitted, "up near the eastern ridge." Mark's eyes widened. "You're serious? What do you think it was?" I shook my head. "I don't know what to think." We decided not to tell the others. Who would believe us? We'd be the laughing stock of the trip. So we made up some story about not seeing anything worth shooting, and no one questioned it. That night at camp, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the darkness beyond our campfire had me on edge. Were they out there, watching us? Had they followed us back to camp? The questions kept spinning in my head. The rest of the hunting trip was a blur. I went through the motions, but my heart wasn't in it. I kept scanning the tree line, jumping at shadows. Mark was the same. We'd share looks sometimes when the others weren't watching. That silent acknowledgement that we'd experienced something that had changed us. When we packed up and headed home a few days later, I felt relief, but also a strange sense of loss. I'd encountered something extraordinary, something few people ever see, and now I was just supposed to go back to normal life. I've been back to those mountains many times since then, but I've never seen anything like that again. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I'll catch a whiff of something musky on the breeze, or hear a sound that's not quite natural, and my heart will start racing. But they've never shown themselves to me again. I've read books about Bigfoot since then, watched documentaries, even joined online forums where people share their own encounters. Some stories sound like fantasy, but others, the ones with those small, specific details that ring true, make me realize I'm not alone in what I saw. That day in the West Virginia mountains taught me that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we think. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw. Two creatures, not human but not animal either, with their own language, their own social structure, living hidden in the forests we think we know. Sometimes I wonder if they remember me too, that startled human they found watching them from a tree. I wonder if they tell their own stories about us. Story 9. Still don't sleep well, even though it's been years since I moved away from that house in the Kanawha Valley. I keep my bedroom window shut no matter how hot it gets, and I can't stand being outside alone after dark. My therapist says I should write this down, that it might help, but I'm not sure anything will make me forget what happened there. I moved into that place around 2003 when I got the bartending job at the Rusty Nail in town. The rent was dirt cheap because nobody wanted to live that far out. The house sat at the base of the Dolly Sods Wilderness area in West Virginia. We're talking seriously remote. No neighbors within shouting distance, just acres of dense forest behind the property that stretched up into the mountains. The closest neighbor was about 1.5 miles down the gravel road. My mom and younger brother moved in with me about 6 months later. Mom got a job at the same bar, working the day shift while I handled nights. My brother was still in high school then. The arrangement worked for us. The place was big enough, and we all appreciated having our space. What we didn't appreciate was what came with it. The night it first happened still feels like yesterday. It was mid-July, hot and sticky, even at 3 in the morning when my shift ended. I remember the crickets were loud as hell that night as I drove up the winding gravel road to our house. There was no moon, just blackness beyond my headlights. The forest seemed to swallow the light. Our house sat in a small clearing with the yard sloping upward toward the tree line, maybe 100 feet from the back door. I always parked facing the woods, not for any particular reason. That's just how the natural turning area worked out. My headlights swept across the tree line as I pulled in, lighting up the first few rows of trees before I cut the engine. The air felt heavy when I stepped out, like it does before a storm. I shut my car door, not slamming it, just pushing it closed with a normal click. That's when it happened. This sound erupted from somewhere near the edge of the woods. I've tried for years to describe it properly, but words just fail. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before or since. It started as this deep, guttural growl that suddenly exploded into a scream so powerful I felt it physically hit my body. Like when you stand too close to the speakers at a concert and feel the bass in your chest. Except this was 100 times more intense. It wasn't just loud, it was forceful, like it came from something with lungs the size of oil drums. The sound had weight to it. It pushed against me. There was intelligence behind it too. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like it was meant specifically for me. I froze for maybe half a second before pure animal instinct kicked in. I don't even remember running to the house. One moment I was by my car, the next I was fumbling with my keys at the front door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, I slammed the door and locked every bolt. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I remember sliding down the door until I was sitting on the floor trying to catch my breath. My brother was asleep, and I didn't want to wake him. I don't know why. Maybe I was embarrassed to admit how terrified I was of a sound. After about 10 minutes, when my breathing finally steadied, I started questioning what I'd heard. Maybe it was just a weird echo of a known animal. West Virginia has plenty of wildlife. Bears, coyotes, foxes, bobcats. I'd heard all their calls before. This wasn't anything like those. I grew up in these mountains. I know what a bear sounds like when it's angry. I know the eerie wails of a bobcat that can sound almost human. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. I remember thinking I should look outside, but I couldn't make myself go near the windows for almost an hour. Finally, I worked up the courage to grab my dad's old 12-gauge shotgun from the closet. I'd been using it for hunting since I was 15, so I felt somewhat safer with it in my hands. I also grabbed this super bright halogen floodlight we kept for power outages. With the gun in one hand and the light in the other, I approached the living room window that faced the yard and my car. The curtain was closed, and I stood to the side of it, heart racing again. Using just my pinky finger, I pulled the edge of the curtain back maybe an inch and peered out. My car sat there, exactly as I'd left it. The yard was empty. The tree line was a wall of darkness beyond the reach of our porch light. I turned on the floodlight and shined it out across the yard, sweeping it back and forth along the edge of the forest. Nothing moved. No glowing eyes reflected back. No shadowy figure. Just trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I stayed up the rest of that night with the shotgun across my lap, sitting in the dark living room watching the yard. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was probably just some animal I didn't recognize, but deep down I knew better. Whatever made that sound was massive, and it had been close, very close. I didn't tell my mom or brother about it the next day. What was I going to say? I heard a scary noise. It sounded childish even in my head. So I kept quiet, although I started parking closer to the house after that night. About 3 weeks later, my mom came home from her late shift at around 1 in the morning. I was still awake, watching TV with the volume low. I heard her car pull up, then the sound of her door closing. Then it happened again. That same ungodly scream from the tree line. Even from inside the house, it was deafening. Seconds later, my mom burst through the front door, white as a ghost. She didn't need to say a word. I knew immediately she'd heard the same thing I had. We stared at each other for a long moment before she finally spoke. "What the hell was that?" Her voice was shaking. "You heard it too?" I asked, relief flooding through me. I wasn't crazy. It was real. We stayed up half the night talking about it. She described exactly what I had experienced, the overwhelming force of the sound, how it seemed to press against her physically, how it didn't match any animal she knew. And my mum knew the local wildlife even better than I did. In the weeks that followed, we started noticing other things. Small branches broken on the trails leading from the woods to our yard. Strange tracks in the mud after rain. Too big for a bear, with a weird shape we couldn't identify. They were almost human-like, but massive, easily twice the size of a man's foot, and sometimes, usually on the nights after one of us worked late, we'd hear heavy movement in the woods behind the house. Not just a deer or raccoon moving through underbrush, but something big enough to make small trees sway. Then my brother had his encounter. He was 17 then, at that stubborn age where he thought he was invincible. He liked to sit on the back porch at night and smoke cigarettes, which he thought we didn't know about. One night around 11, he came flying back into the house, slamming the door behind him. He was shaking so badly he could barely speak. When he finally calmed down, he told us he'd been sitting on the steps smoking when he heard something large moving just beyond the tree line. He thought it might be a deer, so he stayed quiet, hoping to catch a glimpse of it. Then the movement stopped, and he felt like something was watching him. That's when the scream came, so close that he said his cigarette fell from his mouth from the sheer force of the sound. After that, we established some rules. No one goes outside alone after dark. Always keep the floodlights on when coming home at night. And most importantly, Get from the car to the house as quickly as possible. Despite our precautions, it happened again and again. Always the same pattern. One of us would arrive home late, shut the car door, and then that blood-curdling scream would erupt from the forest edge. It was like whatever this thing was, it was watching us, waiting for the sound of the car door to announce our arrival. By my count, I experienced it 3 times, my mum 4 or 5 times, and my brother just that once. He refused to go outside after dark ever again. The strangest part, we never saw it, not clearly anyway. Once, when my mum heard the scream, she swears she saw something large move back into the tree line, taller than a man with a strange loping gait. But it was dark and she was terrified, so she couldn't be sure. Another time, after hearing it, I shined the floodlight toward where the sound came from and caught what looked like 2 reflective eyes about 7 or 8 feet off the ground. They were only visible for a split second before whatever it was stepped back into the darkness. The incident that finally convinced us to move happened on an unusually warm night in late October of 2007. I remember the date clearly because it was just before Halloween and the bar had been busy with a costume party. I got home even later than usual, almost 4 in the morning. I was exhausted and not really thinking about our visitor as I pulled up to the house. The moon was full that night, casting everything in a silvery glow. I remember noticing how beautiful and peaceful it looked as I got out of my car. Maybe that's why I wasn't as cautious as I should have been. I shut my car door and stood there for a moment, fishing in my purse for the house keys. That's when I felt it, this overwhelming sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I froze, keys in hand. The silence was absolute. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. In that moment of stillness, I heard a soft, rhythmic sound coming from the edge of the woods. Breathing. Deep, heavy breathing, like something trying to control a mounting excitement. I couldn't move. Fear had me rooted to the spot. Then a twig snapped, and I heard the unmistakable sound of leaves crunching under weight. Something was moving toward me. That finally broke my paralysis. I ran for the front door, got inside and locked it behind me. I was trembling so badly I had to sit down, but instead of the usual scream, there was nothing, just silence. Somehow, that was worse. About 10 minutes later, as I sat in the darkened living room with the shotgun, I heard a soft thud against the side of the house. Then another, and another. Something was walking around the house, brushing against the siding. I could hear its breathing through the walls, deep, raspy breaths that seemed to linger on the other side of whatever wall I was nearest to, as if it knew exactly where I was standing. This continued for nearly an hour. It circled the house at least 4 times, occasionally stopping at windows to listen, I guess. I never saw it clearly, just a large, dark shadow passing by. At one point, something scraped against the back door. Not like it was trying to get in, more like it was letting me know it could if it wanted to. When it finally left, I heard branches breaking as it moved back into the forest. The sounds grew distant, then faded entirely. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. We moved out 2 weeks later. Over the years since, I've tried to find a rational explanation for what we experienced. I've researched every known animal in the Appalachian region. Nothing matches. I've looked into possible explanations like territorial bears or mountain lions. Nothing fits. I've only told this story to a few people. Most think I'm exaggerating or that we misidentified normal forest sounds. A couple have suggested it might have been a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that something was watching us for years. Something intelligent enough to learn our patterns and routines. Something that knew the sound of our car doors meant we were vulnerable. And something powerful enough to make a sound that could physically push against your body. I still bartend, but now I live in town, surrounded by neighbors and streetlights. I don't miss that house one bit. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners have heard it too. or if it was somehow specifically interested in us. I've never had the courage to go back and ask them. Whatever it was, it changed me forever. I can't look at forests the same way anymore. I can't shake the feeling that there are things out there we don't understand. Things that watch us from the darkness, biding their time, studying our habits. And sometimes when I shut my car door at night, I still find myself holding my breath, waiting for that scream. Chaka tsupta. Story 10. I've been debating whether to write this down for years. Part of me thinks nobody will believe me, and the other part just wants to get it off my chest. What happened that winter afternoon in 2005 changed how I see the forests around our home forever. I've only told a handful of people about this. My sister, my mom, and one close friend who didn't laugh it off. I guess sharing it anonymously here feels safer somehow. It was January 2005, one of those quiet, heavy snow days we get in West Virginia. I was living with my daughter Emma, not her real name, in Job, which is basically a tiny speck on the map with more trees than people. Our house was set back from Holstein Road with this long, winding gravel driveway that was a real pain during snowfalls. It was just the two of us then. Her dad had moved to Pittsburgh for work the previous summer, and we were still adjusting to life on our own. That particular day, it had been snowing since around noon. Not a blizzard or anything, just those big, lazy flakes that pile up quickly. By mid-afternoon, there was already about 4 inches on the ground. Emma was in kindergarten then, and her bus usually dropped her off around 3:30. I remember checking my watch and seeing it was 3:25 when I started down our driveway to meet her. I always met her bus, even though you could see the bus stop from our front window. The driveway was about 200 yards long, carved between tall pines and a couple of old oak trees. In summer it was actually pretty, but in winter it felt isolated in a way that sometimes made me uneasy. The bus was running a few minutes late that day because of the snow. I stood stamping my feet at the end of the driveway, watching my breath cloud in front of me. It was so quiet, that special kind of quiet that only happens when snow is falling and everything else in the world seems to pause. When the yellow bus finally appeared around the bend, I felt that familiar sense of relief I always got when Emma came home. The driver, Mr. Parker, gave me his usual nod as the door squeaked open. Emma bounded down the steps in her purple snow boots and matching jacket, clutching some art project she'd made in class. "Mommy, look what I made!" She was waving this popsicle stick creation as she jumped the last step. "Wow, honey, that's beautiful," I said, taking her hand as the bus pulled away. "Did you have a good day?" And that's how we started our walk back up the driveway. Me listening to her 5-year-old chatter about who sat with who at lunch and how Tommy had gotten in trouble for eating paste again. I was focused on her, nodding along, watching her little face light up as she talked. The snow was coming down harder now, catching in her eyelashes and on her hat. We were maybe halfway up the driveway when I finally looked ahead toward the house, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Standing completely still beneath our second-story porch was something large, brown, and covered in hair. My first thought was bear, but it was standing upright and perfectly still in a way bears just don't. I stopped walking mid-step. Emma was still talking, oblivious, and bumped into my leg when I froze. "Mommy, what's wrong?" I remember forcing myself not to react outwardly. Some primal parental instinct kicked in. Don't frighten your child, stay calm, assess the threat. But inside, my heart was hammering so hard I felt dizzy. "Nothing, sweetie," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Just thought I saw something by the house. Let's keep walking, okay?" I kept my eyes locked on the figure. It hadn't moved at all, but I could now see it was watching us. I grew up in these mountains. I know what a black bear looks like, what a bobcat looks like. We even have the occasional cougar sighting in this part of West Virginia. But this was something else entirely. It stood completely upright, like a man, but much taller, at least 8 feet, maybe more. It had broad shoulders and a thick, barrel-shaped body. The hair covering it wasn't the black of a bear, but a medium brown color, thick and somewhat matted in places. And its face. God, its face is what still haunts me sometimes. There were human-like features there, but wrong somehow. The nose was flatter, more pushed in, and the eyes were what really got me. They were large and deep-set, reminding me eerily of an owl's eyes, intelligent, observant. As we continued to walk, slowly, I saw it blink. Twice, but it never moved otherwise, standing as still as a statue beneath the overhang of our porch. Emma was starting to pick up on my tension. "What are you looking at, Mommy?" I squeezed her hand and tried to sound casual. "Just watching that big animal by our house, honey. We're going to walk over to the side steps, okay?" "What animal? Is it a bear?" She sounded more curious than scared, which was a small blessing. "I'm not sure," I answered truthfully. "But let's stay over on this side of the driveway." I guided us to the far edge of the gravel, keeping as much distance as possible between us and the creature. The whole time, I never broke eye contact with it. I don't know why. Some instinct told me not to. It was watching us with such focus, such intent observation, but made no aggressive moves. The side steps to our second-story porch were about 30 feet from where it stood. My plan was to get up those steps fast, get inside, lock the door, and then figure out what the hell to do next. Call animal control? The police? Who exactly do you call when there's an 8-foot hairy humanoid standing under your porch? As we approached the steps, I positioned myself between Emma and the creature. "Go up the steps, honey. Normal pace, don't run." She started up, then turned back. "Mommy, is that a gorilla?" I looked at the creature again. We were closer now, maybe 20 feet away, and I could see more details. The hair wasn't uniform. It was patchy in some areas, thicker in others. Around the face it was shorter, allowing more of the features to show. Those eyes continued to watch us, blinking occasionally with unmistakable intelligence. "No, not a gorilla," I said softly, backing up the steps behind her. When we reached the top of the steps, we were now elevated above the creature, looking down at it from our second-story porch. It still hadn't moved from its position near the support beams. From this angle, I could better appreciate its massive size. Its head nearly reached the floorboards of the porch above it. Emma, now feeling secure on the porch with me between her and the strange visitor, grew bolder. She picked up a couple of small pebbles from a flower pot I had up there and tossed them in the creature's direction. They fell short, landing in the snow a few feet from it. "Emma!" I whispered sharply, pulling her back. But the creature didn't react at all to the pebbles. It continued its silent observation, those owl-like eyes tracking our movements. It was the complete stillness that unnerved me most. No animal I know stands that still for that long. "Let's go inside now," I said, fumbling with my keys at the door. Once inside, I locked the door immediately and went straight to the phone in the kitchen, though I still wasn't sure who to call. Emma ran to the living room window that overlooked the area where the creature had been standing. "I can't see it anymore, Mommy. Where did it go?" I joined her at the window, my heart still racing. She was right. The area beneath the porch was empty. There were no footprints leading away that I could see, no disturbance in the snow at all. It was as if the thing had simply vanished. I spent the next hour moving from window to window in our house, looking out at the surrounding trees and yard, but there was no sign of the creature. The snow continued to fall, quickly covering any tracks that might have been there. That night, after Emma was asleep, I sat up with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. I'd loaded my father's old shotgun and kept it nearby, though some part of me doubted it would be much use against whatever I'd seen. The next morning, I went out to check beneath the porch. The snow had continued most of the night, covering everything in a fresh blanket of white. If there had been any evidence of the visitor, It was long buried. I scanned the tree line surrounding our property, but saw nothing unusual. In the weeks that followed, I found myself constantly watching the woods around our house. I started driving Emma to the bus stop rather than walking, and I installed motion sensor lights around the property, but the creature never returned, at least not that I saw. I did research, of course. I looked up every large animal native to West Virginia. I even hesitantly searched for Bigfoot sightings West Virginia late one night, feeling slightly ridiculous. There were stories, of course, there always are in rural areas, but nothing that matched exactly what I'd seen. What strikes me most, looking back, is that I never felt threatened by the creature. Terrified, yes, but not because it made any aggressive moves. It was more the shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. Those eyes, though, there was something in them. Not animal-like curiosity, but something deeper. It was observing us, studying us. It's been 18 years since that day, and I've never seen anything like it again. Emma, now grown, remembers it vaguely as that time we saw the big hairy thing, but the details have faded for her. For me, though, the memory remains crystal clear, especially during quiet winter snowfalls. I still live in the same house. Sometimes when I'm alone and the snow is falling just like it was that day, I find myself looking out toward the tree line, wondering if it's out there, watching. And sometimes, though I'd never admit this to anyone but you anonymous internet strangers, I think I catch glimpses of something moving between the trees, something large and brown that disappears when I try to focus on it. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species, or just a bear standing oddly, or some trick of light and shadow made worse by a mother's protective instincts. But I know what I felt when I looked into those eyes. A recognition of something intelligent, something aware, something that knew exactly what it was doing when it stood there perfectly still, watching a mother and daughter return home on a snowy afternoon in Job, West Virginia. And sometimes, that feeling alone is enough to keep me awake at night. Story 11. I never thought I'd be one of those people posting things like this. I'm not into crypto stuff or paranormal things, and I've always been the skeptical type who needs to see the evidence. But what happened to me in Otter Creek Wilderness back in January 2007 still gives me the chills, and it's been bugging me for so long that I finally need to get it out there. It was supposed to be just a normal 4-day backpacking trip in West Virginia. I'd been looking forward to it for months, a chance to disconnect from everything and enjoy some peace and quiet in the wilderness. I went with my buddy Mark. He works for the Division of Wildlife, his fiancée Jen, and their 2 dogs, a German Shepherd named Rex and a mixed breed called Sadie. Mark was experienced in the outdoors and knew the Otter Creek Wilderness area well, so I felt pretty safe despite the winter conditions. The first 2 days were amazing, exactly what I needed. The Otter Creek area near Elkins is beautiful in winter. Everything was covered in a light dusting of snow. There was that crisp, clean air that you can only get in the mountains, and we'd barely seen another soul. We hiked about 8 miles each day, following some of the old logging roads and trails. The nights were cold but not unbearable, and we had good gear. It was the 3rd day when things got weird. We'd hiked to a spot near Yellow Creek and found a nice clearing to set up camp around 3 p.m. Mark and Jen were putting up the tents while I started gathering wood for a fire. The temperature was dropping quickly as the sun was getting lower, probably around 30 degrees by that point. That's when I first noticed that Sadie, usually the calmer of the 2 dogs, was acting strangely. She kept staring into a particular section of woods about 100 yards from our camp, occasionally letting out these low growls. I called to Mark, "Hey, what's up with Sadie?" He glanced over at her and shrugged. "Probably just a deer or something. She gets like that sometimes." I wasn't convinced. The way she was fixated, her body stiff and hackles raised. It just seemed off. But I went back to gathering firewood while Mark continued setting up camp. About an hour later, around 4:30, I was splitting kindling with a hatchet when I heard it. The sound started faint, almost like it was coming from way up the hollow. At first, I thought it was a coyote. We'd heard some the previous night, but as it continued, I realized this was something else entirely. The howl lasted for what felt like forever, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, and maintained the same pitch throughout. Anyone who's heard coyotes knows they usually start low and go up in pitch, often ending with those yipping sounds. This didn't do that. It was steady, powerful, and wrong somehow. I stopped what I was doing and just listened, waiting to see if it would come again. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Even the constant background noise of the creek seemed muted. That's when I noticed both dogs were now standing at attention, staring in the direction the sound had come from. Rex had his ears perked up and was making this weird whining sound I'd never heard from him before. About 2 minutes later, it came again. This time louder, closer. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was like, imagine a woman screaming in pain, but deeper, more guttural, and with this almost primate quality to it. It wasn't human, but it wasn't any animal I'd ever heard either. And I've spent a lot of time in the woods. I've heard coyotes, wolves, cougars, bears. This wasn't any of those. When it stopped, I looked over at Mark. He had stopped hammering in tent stakes and was looking toward the sound. Jen had frozen in place too, halfway through unpacking something from her backpack. "What the hell was that?" I asked. Mark shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Never heard anything like it." Coming from a wildlife officer, that wasn't reassuring. Mark knows the sounds of every animal in these woods. If he couldn't identify it, that meant it was either extremely rare or something else. The third time the howl came, the dogs went nuts. Rex started barking furiously, lunging at his leash, which was tied to a tree. Sadie, usually so calm, was growling deeply, her eyes never leaving the tree line. The sound was definitely closer this time, maybe half a mile away at most. It had that same sustained quality to it, a single, powerful note that just hung in the air. "Maybe we should pack up and head back," Jen suggested, her voice shaky. Mark shook his head. "It's almost 5 now. We wouldn't make it back before dark, and I don't want to be hiking these trails at night. We're safer staying put." I wasn't sure I agreed, but he had a point. The trails were rough and unmarked in places, and in the dark it would be easy to get lost. Plus, if there was something out there, I wasn't sure I wanted to encounter it while we were vulnerable on the trail. We finished setting up camp in record time. No one wanted to stray far from the fire, which we got going as quickly as possible. The dogs wouldn't settle down. They kept pacing, staring into the woods, occasionally growling or barking at nothing we could see. Mark tried to play it cool, but I could tell he was on edge too. He kept his rifle closer than usual. He'd brought it mainly for protection against bears, but now I was glad he had it for whatever was out there. As darkness fell, we huddled around the fire, talking in low voices. No one wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. What kind of animal makes that sound? Mark tried to explain it away as maybe a strange echo effect with a normal animal call, or perhaps some kind of bird we weren't familiar with. But none of his explanations felt right. "I'm telling you," I insisted, "it sounded almost human, but not human at the same time. Maybe it's that Bigfoot you're always reading about," Jen joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood. I had been interested in cryptozoology as a kid, but I'd grown out of it, or at least I thought I had. But sitting there in the dark woods, with that howl still echoing in my mind, I wasn't so sure anymore. We ate dinner in relative silence, everyone listening intently to the forest around us. The howl didn't come again while we were awake, which was somewhat reassuring. By about 9 p.m., exhaustion from the day's hike started to overcome our fear, and we decided to turn in. Mark insisted on keeping the fire going and said he'd stay up a bit longer. I could tell he was worried, which made me even more anxious. My tent was set up about 10 feet from Mark and Jen's, close to a large oak tree. Rex was tied outside Mark's tent, while Sadie was actually in the tent with them, something Mark normally wouldn't allow, but made an exception for given how upset she seemed. I slipped into my sleeping bag, fully clothed, not even bothering to change. I wanted to be ready to move quickly if I needed to. I don't know how long I laid there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves. The wind had picked up, which didn't help my nerves. Every gust made the trees creak and sway, creating all sorts of noises that kept me on edge. I must have eventually drifted off because the next thing I remember is jolting awake to the sound of Rex barking frantically. I checked my watch. It was 2:17 a.m. The barking stopped abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched whine. Then I heard it. Something moving through the brush near the creek. This wasn't a squirrel or a raccoon. Whatever it was big, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling, the splashing of water as it moved along or through the creek. I lay completely still, barely breathing, listening as the movement seemed to circle around our camp. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again. The dogs were going crazy. Rex was making these strangled barking sounds like he wanted to bark but was too scared. And I could hear Sadie whimpering from inside Mark and Jen's tent. The footsteps, and yes, they definitely sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, stopped somewhere behind my tent. I heard what sounded like heavy breathing, deep and raspy. It was close, maybe 20 feet from where I lay frozen in terror. I wanted to call out to Mark to see if he was awake and hearing this too, but I couldn't make my voice work. I was paralyzed with fear. Then came a smell that hit me like a physical force, a powerful, musky odor, like wet dog combined with rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. It was so strong it made my eyes water. It seemed to seep into my tent surrounding me. The thing outside let out a low grunt, not a howl like before, but a deep rumbling sound that I felt more than heard. It was like it was communicating something, though to whom or what I had no idea. Then, unbelievably, there was an answering grunt from further away, up the hollow where we'd heard the original howls. That's when I heard Mark's tent zip open. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady but tense. "Is someone out there?" The silence that followed was absolute. No breathing, no movement, nothing. It was like whatever had been there had vanished the moment a human voice broke the night. "Mark?" I finally managed to call out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Yeah, I'm here," he replied. "You hear that?" "Yeah. What the hell was it?" "I don't know. Get your flashlight and come out slowly." I fumbled for my flashlight, hands trembling so much I almost dropped it. I unzipped my tent as quietly as possible and crawled out. The night was clear and cold, the stars incredibly bright overhead. Mark was standing by the remains of our fire, rifle in one hand, powerful flashlight in the other. Jen was in the tent doorway, looking terrified. Rex was straining at his leash, still staring into the darkness beyond our camp. Mark swept his flashlight beam through the trees, but didn't catch anything. The smell was already fading, though it had definitely been there. Jen mentioned it too, wrinkling her nose in disgust. "Do you think it was a bear?" Jen asked, hopeful. Mark shook his head. "Bears don't move like that, and they don't make those sounds." We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, scanning the darkness, listening. Nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more movement. It was like whatever had been there had decided we weren't worth the trouble and moved on. Or maybe it was still watching, waiting. None of us slept the rest of the night. We rebuilt the fire and sat around it, talking in hushed voices about what it could have been. Mark maintained it was probably just some animal we couldn't identify in the dark. Jen suggested Maybe it was other hikers playing a prank, though we all knew that was unlikely. We hadn't seen another human since we entered the wilderness area. I kept thinking about those howls, the deliberate movement around our camp, the responding grunt from further away. It all seemed too coordinated, too intelligent for a random animal. When dawn finally broke, we packed up in record time, all of us eager to get back to civilization. As we were about to leave, Mark walked over to where we'd heard the movement the night before. I followed him, curious despite my fear. That's when we found them, footprints in the soft earth by the creek. They were large, much larger than any human foot, and had a distinct shape that wasn't quite like any animal track I'd seen. They were roughly 15 inches long and 7 inches wide, with what looked like 5 toes. The stride length between prints was huge, easily 4 or 5 feet apart. Whatever had made them was big, and it walked on 2 legs. Mark stared at the prints for a long time, taking pictures with his digital camera. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was troubled. This wasn't in his professional expertise anymore. We hiked out faster than we'd planned, making it back to the trailhead by early afternoon. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. The dogs seemed to feel it too. They kept looking back, hackles raised. When we got back to civilization, I started researching. I looked up every animal native to West Virginia, listened to recordings of their calls. Nothing matched what we'd heard. Then, almost as a joke, I looked up reported Bigfoot vocalizations. What I found chilled me to the bone. There were recordings online of alleged Bigfoot calls that sounded eerily similar to what we'd heard that night. That same long, sustained howl with the odd primate quality to it. Mark and I have talked about that night many times since then. He's still reluctant to call it a Bigfoot encounter, but he admits he can't explain what happened. The photos he took of the footprints were inconclusive, clear enough to show something unusual, but not detailed enough for definitive identification. I've never gone back to Otter Creek Wilderness. I still go camping and hiking, but something changed for me that night. I'm more cautious now, more aware of how little we really know about what might be out there in the remote parts of our world. I'm not saying for sure that what we encountered was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but I know it wasn't anything I can explain, and it wasn't anything Mark could explain either, despite his wildlife expertise. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that howl again, or smell that strange, musky odor. And I wonder if whatever was watching us that night is still out there in the woods, watching others who venture into its territory, deciding whether to make itself known or remain hidden in the shadows. E-Titters, Story 12. I've been debating whether to share this for a really long time. It happened back on August 2nd, 2008, but I still think about it all the time. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I see those eyes in the dark corner of my bedroom. I know that sounds dramatic, but if you experienced what I did, you'd understand why it stuck with me. My name's Marcus. I've been training hunting dogs most of my life, particularly coonhounds. That night, I was out with my buddy Jim and my red-tick coonhound, Duke. Duke was about 3 years old at the time, already well-trained, but we were working on some tracking exercises in this area we'd been to dozens of times before. It's a remote spot, about 30 minutes from my house, just a dirt road that winds through dense woods. Nothing special about it, just a good training ground with minimal distractions. We arrived around 8:30 that evening. It was August, so we still had a bit of daylight left, but the sun was definitely getting low. The plan was simple. Drive down the road a bit, let Duke pick up some scents, work on his tracking for an hour or so, then head home. Just a normal training session like we'd done countless times before. I had my old Ford pickup, and Duke was riding in the bed like always, alert and ready to work. Jim was riding shotgun, and we were just catching up on life stuff as we drove slowly down that dusty road. The windows were down, and you could smell that heavy summer air. You know, that mixture of dirt, pine, and humidity that hangs around in the woods during August in these parts. We'd gone maybe 3 miles down this road when Duke suddenly perked up. His ears went forward, and he started that low growl he does when he's picked up something interesting. As a trainer, you learn to read your dog's signals, and Duke was definitely alerting to something in the woods to our right. I stopped the truck, put it in park, and reached for my mining light. It's this really powerful LED headlamp I wear for night tracking. Jim had a decent flashlight too, but mine was the stronger one by far. I hopped out, went around to the tailgate and lowered it so Duke could jump down. He was excited but controlled, exactly what you want from a working dog. "What do you think he's got?" Jim asked, getting out and walking around to join me. I shrugged. "Probably a raccoon or maybe a deer." Nothing unusual about that. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest. Wildlife was expected. Duke started sniffing along the edge of the road, his nose working overtime. I strapped on my headlamp and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the tree line. That's when I saw them. A set of eyes reflecting back at my light from about 40 yards into the woods. Now, seeing eye shine at night isn't unusual when you're out in the country. Raccoons, deer, coyotes, they all have reflective eyes. But something about these was immediately off. First, they were bluish-green, which isn't common for wildlife around here. Second, they were high, maybe 5 or 6 feet off the ground. Too high for a deer unless it was on a hill, and the terrain was pretty flat there. I focused my light on the eyes, trying to make out what animal they belonged to, but the undergrowth was thick, and all I could see were those eyes staring back. They weren't moving much, just fixed in one spot, watching us. Then I noticed something that sent a chill through me. They blinked. Slow, deliberate blinks. Whatever was watching us was doing exactly that, watching us, studying us. "Hey, Jim," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come check this out." Jim walked over and I pointed out the eyes. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's big. Look how high off the ground those eyes are." We stood there for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just watching those eyes as they occasionally blinked. Duke had noticed them too, and he was standing stiff-legged at the edge of the road, hackles raised slightly but not barking. That was unusual for him. Duke was trained to bay when he treed something, but he was just standing there, tense and quiet. After a bit, curiosity got the better of our common sense. "Let's get a better look," I suggested. Jim hesitated but then nodded. We both had hunting knives on our belts. Not that we expected trouble, but it was just habit when in the woods. I called Duke to heel, and he stuck close to my leg as we started across the small ditch that separated the road from the forest. The ground was uneven and covered with fallen branches and undergrowth. There was an old, broken-down fence, probably from when this land was farmed decades ago, that we had to step over. I was trying to keep my light trained on those eyes, while also watching my footing, which wasn't easy. The eyes never moved, just stayed fixed in place, blinking occasionally. We'd made it maybe 20 yards in, when suddenly the eyes were gone. Just vanished. Not like something running away where you might see movement or hear breaking branches. They just disappeared. "Where'd they go?" Jim asked, sweeping his flashlight around. "I don't know," I said. "Let's check it out." We kept going, reaching the spot where we thought the eyes had been, about 40 or 50 yards from the road. There was nothing there, no animal, no tracks that we could see, nothing disturbed. Duke was sniffing around nervously, not tracking anything specific, which was strange. He seemed uneasy, sticking closer to me than usual. We searched the area for about 5 minutes, looking up in the trees, checking the ground for tracks, trying to figure out what we'd seen. Nothing made sense. Something that big should have left some sign, and we shouldn't have lost sight of it if it ran off. "This is weird, man," Jim said eventually. "Let's head back to the truck." I agreed. The whole situation had me spooked, though I didn't want to admit it. We turned around and started making our way back toward the road. Duke was leading now, clearly eager to get back to the truck. We'd gone past our vehicle and were about 60 yards down the road, with me shining my light ahead to guide our way, when something made me turn and shine my light back toward the woods where we'd seen the eyes. They were back. The same bluish-green eyes, in almost the exact same spot. But this time, there was something else. A second pair of eyes, higher up than the first. These were different, a reddish-orange color, and they were at least 7 feet off the ground, maybe higher. My blood went cold. "Jim," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Look." Jim turned and saw them too. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "What the hell are those?" Duke saw them too and started growling, a deep, serious growl that I'd never heard from him before. He wasn't running toward them like he would with normal game. He was backing up, pressing against my legs. "Let's get out of here," I said, not taking my eyes off those 2 pairs of eyes watching us from the darkness. We didn't run. Something told me that would be a bad idea. But we walked quickly back to the truck. I opened the tailgate and Duke jumped in immediately. I secured him with his lead, then Jim and I got into the cab. I started the engine, hands shaking slightly, and turned the truck around to head back down the dirt road. Before we pulled away, I turned off the interior light and rolled down my window. I shined my headlamp back toward the forest. Both pairs of eyes were still there, blinking occasionally, watching us. Even from inside the vehicle, I could see them clearly in the darkness. It was the most unnerving feeling I've ever had, like they were studying us, waiting for something. I put the truck in gear and started driving, probably faster than was safe on that rough dirt road. As we headed downhill, Duke started barking frantically in the truck bed. I could hear him moving around back there, obviously agitated. "What's he barking at?" Jim asked, turning to look out the rear window. I slowed the truck, just enough to be safe, and shined my light up through my window back toward the ridge we'd just left. My stomach dropped. Both creatures, whatever they were pacing along the ridgeline following us. I couldn't see their bodies clearly, just dark, massive shapes moving through the trees, their eyes reflecting in my light. "They're following us," I said, pressing harder on the accelerator. Duke was going absolutely crazy now, barking and snarling in a way I'd never heard before. Jim rolled down his window and stuck his head out, trying to get a better look. "I can't make out what they are," he said, his voice tight with fear. "But they're big, Marcus. Really big." We continued down that dirt road for about half a mile, with those things keeping pace with us on the ridge. They weren't running. It was more like they were walking quickly, easily keeping up with our truck, despite the rough terrain they were navigating. Eventually, the road curved away from the ridge, and we lost sight of them. Duke quieted down somewhat, though he remained alert and watchful, facing backward in the truck bed. The drive back to the main road was tense. We barely spoke, both of us scanning the darkness outside the windows, half expecting to see those eyes again. When we finally hit pavement, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "What do you think those were?" Jim finally asked as we headed toward town. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Too big for a bear. Wrong eye color anyway." "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Jim asked. I didn't answer immediately. The idea seemed ridiculous in the safety of my truck on a paved road, but back there, in the darkness of those woods, it hadn't seemed so far-fetched. "Bigfoot," I finally said, almost embarrassed to say it out loud. "2 of them," Jim corrected. "Did you notice how they moved? Not like any animal I've ever seen." I nodded. Their movement had been smooth, deliberate, almost human-like, but faster and more efficient through the rough terrain. And those eyes, one pair bluish-green, one reddish-orange, higher off the ground than any normal wildlife should be. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Duke was different too. Usually after training, he'd be exhausted and sleep soundly. That night, he paced around my bedroom, checking the windows periodically, on edge. It's been 15 years since that night, and I've never gone back to that particular spot. I've trained other dogs since Duke passed on, but I stick to more populated areas now. Jim and I don't talk about what happened much, but sometimes when we're having beers, one of us will ask, "Remember that night?" And the other just nods. We don't need to elaborate. I've read accounts of other people's encounters since then. Some descriptions match what we experienced. The height, the eye shine, the way they moved. I've become convinced that what we saw that night were two Sasquatch, maybe a parent and child or a mated pair. I don't know why they were so interested in us or why they followed us. Were they curious, territorial, protecting something? I still go hunting, still train dogs, but I'm more cautious now. I pay attention to my surroundings differently. And sometimes, when I'm in the woods and the light starts to fade, I find myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see those eyes again. One pair bluish-green, one reddish-orange, blinking slowly as they watch me from the darkness. The strangest part? Duke never barked the same way after that night. He'd alert to game, track as he was trained to do. But that frantic, terrified barking I heard in the truck bed as those things followed us down the ridge, I never heard him make that sound again. It was like he'd seen something that fundamentally changed him, something his dog brain couldn't process. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Hell, if someone had told me this before I experienced it, I'd probably be skeptical too. But I know what I saw that night. I know what followed us. And sometimes I still feel like something's watching me from the trees when I'm outdoors after dark. Something tall, intelligent, and patient. And I still dream about those eyes. Story 13. I've been going back and forth for months about whether to post this. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest and maybe connect with others who've experienced something similar in the Randolph County area of West Virginia. This happened in early July 2017, just over 6 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Some details are burned into my memory in a way I can't explain. I'm an avid fisherman, been trout fishing since I was a kid. My dad taught me, and the mountains and rivers of West Virginia have always been my second home. I know the Shavers Fork of the Cheat River like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did until that day. It was a perfect summer morning, clear skies, around 70 degrees, with that clean mountain air that just makes you grateful to be alive. I'd gotten up at 4:30 that morning to make the drive out to one of my favorite spots. I like fishing alone, always have. There's something about the solitude that lets me think clearly, and honestly, I'm just more successful when I'm not chatting or worrying about someone else's experience. I'd been having a pretty good day, caught and released 4 decent-sized rainbow trout in the morning, then took a break around 11 to have the sandwich and apple I'd packed. By early afternoon, I'd moved to a section of the river I particularly like. It splits around a small island, creating 2 channels that converge again downstream. The island itself isn't very big, maybe 30 yards long, but it's covered with thick vegetation, rhododendrons, mountain laurel, a few pines, and some deciduous trees I couldn't name. I was wading waist-deep in the right channel, working my way slowly upstream. The water was running clear that day, cold against my waders, with that constant, gentle rushing sound that drowns out everything else. I was completely focused on casting, watching my line drift in the current, totally in the zone. That's when it happened. I heard a sharp, distinct crack, like someone had stepped on a thick, dry branch. It wasn't just any twig snap. This was loud enough to hear over the river sounds, like a baseball bat breaking. My head jerked up immediately toward the island, and there it was, standing at the edge of the brush on the island, maybe 60 yards away, was something. I'm 6'1", and whatever this was towered over me by at least another foot, probably more. It was completely dark, either dark brown or black. I couldn't tell for sure in the dappled forest light. What I could see clearly was that it was covered in hair from head to toe. Not patchy like a mangy bear, but uniform, like a thick coat. But it wasn't a bear. No way. It was standing completely upright on two legs, not hunched forward like a bear might briefly stand, but fully erect with a posture that was unmistakably human-like. Its shoulders were massive, much broader than any person I've ever seen. Its arms hung down at its sides, proportionally longer than a human's would be. The most bizarre detail, and I swear this is exactly what I saw, it was holding what looked like a massive stick or staff in its right hand. This wasn't some twig. This was a substantial piece of wood, probably 5 or 6 inches thick and at least as tall as the creature itself. It was holding it vertically, like you might hold a walking stick. But this was no walking stick. This was like a small tree trunk. I wish I could describe its face, but I couldn't make out details at that distance. And honestly, I was in such shock that my brain wasn't processing everything. All I registered was a dark face, hairier than a human's would be, with no discernible features except for what seemed like a prominent brow. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 5 or 6 seconds. I was frozen, my fly rod still extended mid-cast, water rushing around my legs. The creature seemed to notice me at the same moment I noticed it. There was this split second where we just observed each other. I felt seen in a way that's hard to explain, like it was assessing me. Then it turned and walked, not ran, but walked with purpose, downstream along the island's edge. Its movement was smooth and deliberate. 2, maybe 3 strides, and it disappeared into the denser vegetation. The way it moved was nothing like a bear or any other animal I've encountered in these woods. It had a fluid, bipedal gait that was eerily human, but also not. I stood there completely still for what felt like forever, but was probably just a minute or 2. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel my pulse in my ears, louder than the river. My mouth had gone completely dry. I remember a very specific thought going through my head. I have absolutely nothing to protect myself with. No sidearm, no bear spray, not even a decent knife. Just my fishing gear and car keys. I suddenly felt incredibly vulnerable, standing there in the middle of the river. I waited about 15 minutes before I even attempted to move. The whole time, I kept scanning the island, the surrounding forest, expecting to see it again. I kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe another hunter in dark clothes. But I knew better. I've been in these woods my whole life. I know what bears look like, how they move. This was something else entirely. When I finally did move, I backed my way downstream, never turning my back to where the creature had disappeared. My legs felt wobbly, like I might slip on the river rocks at any moment. I kept one hand on my fishing rod and the other free to catch myself if I fell. I didn't even bother reeling in properly, just held my rod awkwardly as I retreated. The walk back to my truck was the longest quarter-mile of my life. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing and the decreasing noise of the river behind me. I remember being hyper-aware of every snap and rustle in the forest. Twice I froze completely, convinced I heard heavy footsteps following me, but I never saw anything. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back without organizing it, very unlike me, and got inside, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a few minutes just breathing and trying to calm down enough to drive safely. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble getting the key in the ignition. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, not my fishing buddies, not my co-workers, not even my wife at first. Who would believe me? I've always been the practical type, never put much stock in cryptids or supernatural things. I work in construction management, for God's sake. I deal in measurements and materials and timelines, not whatever this was. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. I'd jolt awake thinking I heard that same branch-breaking sound outside our bedroom window. I stopped fishing alone, made excuses when my regular buddies invited me out or insisted we go to more populated areas. About a month later, I finally told my wife. We were sitting on our back porch one evening, and something about the quiet and the privacy of the moment made it possible. I remember starting the story and then stopping several times, worried she'd think I was losing my mind. But she listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she just squeezed my hand and said, "I believe you saw something, Tom. I don't know what it was, but I believe you." That meant everything to me. What really surprised me came about 6 months later during a holiday visit to my parents. My dad and I were having a beer in his garage while he tinkered with his old Chevy, and somehow we got on the subject of strange experiences. I took a deep breath and told him my story. I expected skepticism, maybe even some gentle ribbing. Instead, he put down his wrench, looked me straight in the eye and said, "I've been following Bigfoot sightings in those mountains for 40 years, son. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Turns out my quiet, practical father, a former park ranger, had been collecting newspaper clippings and first-hand accounts of Sasquatch sightings in the Appalachians since before I was born. He showed me a folder with dozens of reports, some dating back to the 70s. Many described similar details: the height, the dark hair, the human-like gait. A few even mentioned the stick or club some witnesses had seen these creatures carrying. Since then, I've done my own research. I've found online forums and local groups of people who've had similar encounters. I still fish the Shaver's Fork, but never alone and never without being armed. I've never seen the creature again, though sometimes, when I'm near that island, I get this prickling sensation on the back of my neck that's hard to shake. I returned to the spot a couple weeks after it happened, this time with my buddy Mike, who thinks I just saw a bear, and looked for tracks or evidence. The ground was too rocky and root-covered to show anything clear. I did find a broken sapling near where I believed the creature had been standing, snapped about 5 feet up, not cut or sawed, but that could have been caused by anything. The detail that still gets me, that I can't explain away, is that wooden staff or club it was carrying. Why would any known animal carry a tool like that? And if it was a person in some kind of costume, which makes zero sense in that remote location, why would they be carrying what looked like a small tree trunk? I don't know what I saw that day. I'm not claiming it was definitely a Bigfoot or Sasquatch, though that's the closest description I can come up with. All I know for certain is that it was large, bipedal, covered in dark hair, and moved with an intelligence that still unnerves me when I think about it. If you've seen something similar in Randolph County or anywhere around the Monongahela National Forest, I'd like to hear about it. My father was right. Talking about these experiences helps, not just to process them, but to let others know they're not alone if they've seen something they can't explain. I still go fishing as often as I can. I still love these mountains and rivers, but I no longer feel like I'm at the top of the food chain when I'm out there alone. Something else shares these woods, something that watches and knows and understands far more than we give it credit for, and it carries a big stick. Story 14. I've never told many people about what happened to me that day. Even now, almost 60 years later, I can still remember every detail of that summer afternoon in 1963. I was 10 years old, and it changed the way I looked at the woods forever. My dad worked for the Forest Service near Troy, Idaho, and sometimes during summer break, he'd take me along to help at the stumpage sites. I loved those days, getting to skip chores at home, watching Dad work, and exploring the forest. That particular day in July, we drove up to Moscow Mountain early in the morning. The air was still cool, and mist hung between the trees as we bounced along the logging road in Dad's old truck. "Marcus, stay close today," Dad told me as we pulled up to the site. "Lots of brush around here, don't want you getting lost." Dad, William Turner was his name, was a man of few words. When he did speak, I listened. He grabbed his chainsaw from the truck bed while I carried our lunch pail. The site was beautiful. Tall red firs spaced out between dense patches of cedar groves. Natural springs bubbled up in some areas, creating small wet patches where ferns grew thick. The kind of perfect forest that makes you feel small, but in a good way. Dad had marked a massive cedar for falling that day. It was easily 5 feet across at the base, and he spent a while walking around it, figuring out the best way to bring it down safely. I sat on a stump nearby, watching and occasionally handing him tools when he asked. About an hour into the work, I noticed Dad kept stopping and looking up from his saw. He'd scan the tree line, then go back to work. I started feeling it too, that weird sensation of being watched. At first, I thought maybe it was a forest ranger coming to check on us, or maybe some hunters passing through, though it wasn't hunting season. "Dad, is somebody watching us?" I finally asked. He wiped sweat from his forehead with his forearm and glanced around again. "Probably just an elk or maybe a bear cub curious about the noise. Nothing to worry about, buddy." But I could tell he was unsettled too. He kept working, making the precise cuts needed to fell the giant cedar safely. The chainsaw's roar echoed through the trees, drowning out the forest sounds. Every time he shut it off to reposition, though, the silence felt heavy. Finally, with a series of loud cracks, the tree began to fall. Dad yelled, "Timber!" more out of habit than necessity, since it was just us there, and we watched as the massive cedar crashed down a brush-covered slope, taking smaller trees with it. Once the dust settled, Dad began trimming branches. I asked if I could explore the fallen tree, and he nodded, telling me to be careful on the trunk. I was so excited. Climbing a freshly fallen giant like that was an adventure for a 10-year-old kid. The trunk was like a massive highway leading up the slope. I ran up the trunk, balancing with my arms out. The bark was still warm from the friction of falling. I got about halfway up when I heard something moving in the brush to my right. I froze, thinking maybe it was a deer, startled by the tree coming down. What happened next still makes my heart race when I think about it. Someone jumped onto the tree trunk with me. It landed about 3 feet away, crouching there, just staring at me. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was roughly my size, maybe a bit bigger, but way more muscular. It had a face that looked like a chimpanzee from the encyclopedia we had at school, but different somehow. Its eyes were dark and intelligent, fixed right on mine. The fur was short and clean, almost shiny in the patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. Not matted or dirty like you'd expect from a wild animal. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. Then it tilted its head slightly, almost like it was confused by me. That small movement broke whatever spell had frozen me in place. I screamed. It flinched at the sound, then turned and ran. Not on all fours like I'd expect from a monkey or ape, but upright on 2 legs, disappearing into the brush with surprising speed for something its size. I nearly fell off the log, scrambling backward. I don't even remember running back to Dad, but suddenly I was there, grabbing his leg, babbling about a big monkey that had jumped on the tree with me. Dad immediately stopped working and knelt down, holding my shoulders. "What did you see, Marcus? Tell me slowly." I described it between gasps, how it looked right at me, how clean it was, how it ran away on 2 legs. Dad looked concerned, but quickly shifted to a calming voice. "Sounds like you saw a bear cub, son. They get curious sometimes." "It wasn't a bear, Dad. It had a face like a monkey. It stood up like a person." Dad glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Listen, Marcus, sometimes our eyes play tricks on us in the forest. Light and shadows can make things look different than they are." But I could tell he was worried. He kept looking over at the brush where I'd pointed. He picked up his chainsaw and carried it closer than normal as we moved around the site for the rest of the day. We finished early, and Dad was quieter than usual on the drive home. That night, I heard him talking in low tones to my mom in the kitchen. I crept down the hallway to listen. "Don't want to scare him more than he already is," Dad was saying. But I felt it too, like something watching us all morning. "You think it was a bear?" Mom asked. There was a long pause. I don't know what it was, but the way he described it. Bears don't have faces like that. Should you report it to someone? And say what? My kids saw a monkey in the Idaho forest. They'd think I'm crazy. Best to just let it be. I went back to bed confused and scared. Dad had felt it too, but he didn't believe me about what I'd seen. Or maybe he did, but didn't want to admit it. The next day at breakfast, Dad acted like nothing had happened. But I noticed he started taking his hunting rifle to work sites after that. He never did before. When school started that fall, I told my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Pearson, about what happened. She seemed genuinely interested and concerned, not dismissive like Dad. She even called Moscow Idaho State University to ask if any circus had reported missing animals, or if the zoology department had any escaped specimens. They hadn't. Something else strange happened in the weeks after my encounter. The cattle in the pastures near Moscow Mountain started acting weird. Mr. Nielsen, whose farm bordered the forest, complained that his normally docile herd was agitated and nervous, especially at dusk. They'd bunch together defensively and sometimes even charge at people walking near the fence line, behavior they'd never shown before. It was like something had been harassing them. I started having nightmares about the creature. In my dreams, it would be standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me with those intelligent eyes. I'd wake up in cold sweats, convinced it was in my room. Eventually, the dreams faded, but I never forgot what I saw. I went back to that area with Dad several times over the next few summers, but we never saw anything unusual again. Still, I could tell Dad was more cautious. He'd scan the tree lines more frequently, keep me closer, and always brought his rifle. Years later, when I was in high school, I found a book in the library about unexplained phenomena. There was a short chapter on wild men sightings in the Pacific Northwest. One account from a logger in Washington state described seeing a juvenile Sasquatch that matched almost exactly what I'd seen, right down to the clean appearance and the way it moved on two legs. I remember sitting there in the library, my hands shaking as I read the description. I showed Dad the book that evening. He read the page silently, then closed it and handed it back to me. "You still think about that day, huh?" he asked. "Don't you?" He looked out the window toward the mountains for a long moment. "There are things in those forests that don't have names, Marcus. Things that know how to stay hidden. Maybe it's better that way." It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging that what I saw might have been real. As an adult, I've tried to find logical explanations for what happened that day. Could it have been another kid playing a prank? No, we were miles from any homes, and the way it moved wasn't human. A bear cub? Not with that face and the way it stood and ran. An escaped exotic pet? Possibly, but there were no reports of anything like that in the area. The forest around Moscow Mountain was perfect habitat for something to remain hidden. Widely spaced trees with dense undergrowth in patches, natural springs providing water, plenty of berries and game for food. The logging operations were spread out, leaving vast areas untouched for years at a time. What bothers me most, even now, is the intelligence I saw in its eyes. It wasn't just curiosity. There was recognition there, an awareness that we were somehow similar, but different. It seemed just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. That's not something animal eyes show you. That's something else entirely. I've gone back to those woods many times over the decades, sometimes hoping to see it again, sometimes praying I won't. I never have. But sometimes, when I'm hiking alone and the forest goes suddenly quiet, I get that familiar feeling of being watched. And for just a moment, I'm 10 years old again, standing on that fallen cedar, face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I don't know what it was that I saw that summer day in 1963, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, and it wasn't my imagination. I've carried the memory of those few seconds for almost 60 years now, and I'm no closer to understanding what happened than I was then. All I know is that when people talk about Sasquatches or Bigfoot like they're just campfire stories, I don't laugh. I remember those eyes looking into mine, and I wonder if somewhere in those mountains it remembers me too. Story 15. I've never really told this story to many people outside the family. Most folks would think I was crazy or making it up. And honestly, I've questioned what we saw that night myself over the years. But I know what all 6 of us witnessed, and nearly 60 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was early June 1963. I was 27 at the time, and we were having a family hunting trip near Grandview, Idaho. Me, my brother Frank, our cousin Lyle, my uncle Pete, and my 2 younger brothers, Sam and Dean. We'd all gone out for some rabbit hunting. It was something we did pretty regularly back then. We'd take my uncle's old Chevy pickup, load up some rifles and spotlights, and head out to Canyon County, where the jackrabbits were plentiful. That particular Saturday, we'd had a decent day hunt. Bagged about 7 rabbits total, nothing spectacular, but we were having fun. As dusk settled in, we decided to continue hunting into the night. Night hunting for jackrabbits was often more productive anyway. You'd catch their eyes in the spotlights. They'd freeze up, making them easier targets. We drove down Mud Flat Road as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The evening air had that clean, cool feeling that desert country gets after a hot day. I remember the smell of sagebrush was particularly strong that night. Must have been some rain earlier in the week that brought out the oils in the plants. Around 9:30 or 10, we pulled off onto this little dirt path that jutted off the main road. Uncle Pete killed the engine, and we all climbed out to stretch our legs and take a leak before continuing the hunt. We were in this wide open area with sagebrush spreading out in all directions, and in the distance, maybe a mile or 2 away, the foothills began rising up toward the mountains. The moon was bright that night, not quite full but close, and it cast this silvery glow across the landscape that made the sagebrush look almost blue-gray. "Let's scan the area before we move on," Frank suggested, so I grabbed the spotlight from the truck bed. It was one of those big handheld spotlights that plugged into the cigarette lighter with a long cord, powerful enough to catch eyeshine from a 1/4 mile away. I started sweeping the beam across the sagebrush, moving in a slow arc from left to right. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of terrain maybe 100 yards out. Nothing unusual at first, just sagebrush, rocks, the occasional small animal darting away. Then I saw it. I nearly dropped the spotlight. About 200 yards out, moving perpendicular to us from right to left, was a figure. Not a rabbit or a coyote, not a deer, a large, upright figure. "Holy shit," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Look at that." The others crowded around me, following the beam of light. "What the hell is that?" Sam asked, his voice tight with tension. The figure was moving fast, really fast, across the landscape. It was running upright on 2 legs, but with a gait that seemed both familiar and wrong at the same time. It was covering ground in these long, powerful strides, easily clearing sagebrush that would have been waist-high on me. "Is that a person?" Dean asked, but we all knew it wasn't. For one thing, who would be out here, miles from anywhere, running through sagebrush in the dark? For another, this thing was big, tall, and broad-shouldered, and the way it moved was just wrong. Too fluid, too powerful, too fast. I tried to keep the light on it as it ran, but it was difficult with how quickly it was moving. The figure suddenly seemed to sense our presence, or at least the light, because it changed direction slightly, angling more directly away from us. That's when I got a better look at it. The body was covered in something dark, hair or fur, I couldn't tell. It had long arms that swung in rhythm with its stride. The head sat directly on the shoulders, no real neck that I could discern, and it moved with this bizarre athletic grace, leaping over obstacles and covering ground faster than any human I'd ever seen. "What the hell is that thing?" Frank whispered. None of us answered. We were transfixed, Watching this impossible creature run across the sagebrush flats, I remember the silence around us. Even the usual nighttime sounds, insects, distant coyotes, seemed to have gone quiet. All I could hear was our collective breathing and the faint sound of the engine ticking as it cooled. The creature reached a gully about 400 yards from us, just a depression in the landscape, maybe 6 or 7 feet deep, that ran like a scar across the terrain. In a single bound, it cleared the entire width of that gully and continued running on the other side. "Jesus Christ," Uncle Pete muttered. In all my years, I'd never heard him sound scared. He was a Korean war vet, tough as nails, but his voice trembled. We watched until the figure disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of our spotlight. None of us spoke for what felt like minutes. Lyle was the first to break the silence. "Was that one of those things people talk about seeing in the woods?" No one wanted to say the word, but we were all thinking it. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I'd heard stories, of course, everyone had, but I'd always dismissed them as tall tales. Not anymore. "Should we go after it?" Dean asked. He was the youngest, just 19, always a bit more reckless than the rest of us. "Are you out of your damn mind?" Frank said. "With what? The truck can't navigate this terrain, and I'm not walking out there with just flashlights and rifles." He was right. The ground was uneven, covered with thick sagebrush, rocks, and those gullies cutting across the landscape. The truck would bottom out within 50 yards, and the idea of pursuing that thing on foot in the dark was insane. Plus, none of us really wanted to get closer to whatever that was. "Let's get back on the road," Uncle Pete said firmly, his hands clutching his rifle a little too tightly. "I think we're done hunting for tonight." No one argued. We piled back into the truck, and Uncle Pete started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating just a small patch of the vast, empty landscape in front of us. I kept scanning the darkness with the spotlight as we backed up and turned around, half expecting to see that figure again, watching us from the shadows. I didn't see anything, but that almost made it worse. It could be anywhere out there. The drive home was unusually quiet. Normally we'd be joking around, recounting the day's hunt, but that night we were all lost in our own thoughts. I kept replaying what we'd seen in my mind, trying to make sense of it. "Could it have been a bear?" Sam suggested after about 20 minutes of silence. We all knew better. "You ever seen a bear run on 2 legs for that distance?" I asked. "Or jump a gully like that?" "Maybe someone playing a prank," Dean offered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Out here? Miles from anywhere?" Frank shook his head. "Who would even know we'd be here?" "It was no damn bear and no damn person," Uncle Pete said firmly. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't either of those things." That killed the conversation for another 10 miles. "We should report it," Lyle finally said as we approached the outskirts of town. "Report what exactly?" Uncle Pete asked. "That we saw some big hairy thing running through the sagebrush? Who'd believe that? Fish and Game would think we were drunk or pulling their leg." He was right about that too. This was 1963 in rural Idaho. People didn't talk about these things, at least not officially. Sure, there were stories passed around at bars and family gatherings, hunters claiming to have seen strange things deep in the woods, but reporting it officially, we'd be laughed out of the county. When we got back to Uncle Pete's place, we unloaded the truck in silence. The rabbits we'd shot earlier seemed insignificant now. I remember looking at their small, furry bodies and thinking about that massive figure running across the sagebrush. Different worlds. Before we all headed to our respective homes, Uncle Pete gathered us in his kitchen. He poured each of us a shot of whiskey, even Dean, who was technically underage. "Look," he said, his voice low and serious, "we all saw something out there tonight. Something that doesn't make sense. I don't know what it was, and maybe we never will. But I think we should keep this between us, at least for now. We all nodded in agreement. What else could we do? People will think we're crazy, Frank said, downing his whiskey in one gulp. Or attention-seeking liars, Lyle added. So we agree, this stays in the family. Uncle Pete looked at each of us, and we all nodded, and for the most part, we kept that agreement. Over the years, we'd occasionally discuss it among ourselves, comparing memories, trying to make sense of what we saw. Our descriptions remained remarkably consistent, a large, hair-covered bipedal creature moving with incredible speed and agility across difficult terrain. Not a bear, not a person, something else entirely. I've gone back to that area a few times over the decades. It's changed some, more development, roads pushed farther into the wilderness, but those foothills and that sagebrush country are still there. I always get this crawling sensation up my spine when I'm out there, like I'm being watched. That night changed how I see the wilderness. I used to think I understood the natural world, that all the mysteries had been catalogued and explained. Now I know better. There are things out there that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadows beyond our understanding. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I can still see that figure running through the sagebrush, its powerful strides eating up the ground, disappearing into that gully with a leap no human could manage. And I wonder where it went after it vanished from our spotlight. Where do creatures like that hide? How have they remained hidden for so long? I'm an old man now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Part of me hopes I never do, but another part wishes I could get one more glimpse, maybe in daylight this time, just to confirm that I wasn't imagining things, that what 6 grown men saw that night in the Idaho wilderness was real. Because if it was real, and I believe it was, then we know so much less about our world than we think we do, and that's both terrifying and strangely comforting. So that's my story. Take it for what it's worth. I know what I saw that night in 1963, and nothing in the 6 decades since has convinced me otherwise. Something out there shares this world with us, something that most people don't believe exists. But it does. I've seen it, and I'll carry that knowledge with me until the day I die.